Hey friend, welcome back. If you're watching this right now, I want you to get comfortable seriously. Stretch out a little, maybe dim the lights, because tonight I'm going to take you somewhere you've never been. Not a faraway country, not another planet. I'm going to take you back in time to a single morning, thousands of miles away, hundreds of years ago, a morning that looks nothing like yours. Here's what I want you to imagine. A woman opens her eyes. It is pitch dark outside. She has no alarm clock, no phone to check, no coffee maker humming in the kitchen. And yet she gets up, not because she wants to, but because the entire world around her depends on it. Now at the exact same moment across the English countryside, another woman is still in bed. She won't rise for another 4 hours, and when she does, she won't lift a single finger for herself. Same century, same country, same sunrise. Two completely different worlds. That difference, that invisible line drawn before breakfast, is what this whole series is about. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something small, but it genuinely means a lot to me. If you've been here before, if my voice has ever kept you company late at night, would you take just a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel? And hey, if this is your first time here, welcome. I really hope you stay. You don't have to do anything right now except settle in. But if at some point tonight, somewhere in the middle of this story, you feel something, feel free to leave a comment and tell me. Tell me where you are, what time it is, what you're doing while you're listening. I genuinely love reading those. Now soften those lights if you can. Maybe turn a fan on low. Let the room get quiet, and let me tell you a story about the women who came before us. Okay, let's start at the very beginning of the day, because before we talk about what women did, we need to talk about when they woke up. And I promise you that detail alone will change how you see everything. Picture England, around the year 1300. A woman, let's call her Agnes, because that was one of the most common women's names in medieval England. Agnes is lying on a straw-stuffed mattress on the floor of a one-room cottage. It's dark. It's cold. She can see her own breath. There is no window, just a small gap near the roof where smoke from last night's fire slips out. Now here is the thing about Agnes's world that most people don't realize. She didn't sleep the way you sleep. She didn't sleep the way I sleep. According to historian Roger E. Kirch, who spent over 20 years researching sleep habits, across pre-industrial Europe, people in the Middle Ages slept in 2 separate shifts. Not one long stretch of 8 hours. 2. They called the first one first sleep. It started shortly after sunset, maybe 8 or 9 in the evening, and it lasted about 4 hours. Then somewhere around midnight they woke up. Not because something was wrong, because that was simply natural. That was normal. This waking period, this strange quiet hour in the middle of the night, had its own name in English, the watch. In France they called it after Premier Somme. In Italy, Primo Sonno. And Kirch found evidence of this 2-sleep pattern in over 500 original historical sources, diaries, medical texts, prayer books, even ballads. One Old English ballad actually includes the line, "At the wakening of your first sleep you shall have a hot drink made." So yes, women like Agnes had someone making them warm drinks at midnight, not because anyone was sick, just because that was life. And what did Agnes do during the watch? Well, she might check on the fire, add a log before it died completely. She might mend a piece of cloth by the dim light of a rush candle, which was not a real candle, but literally a strip of dried rivery dipped in animal fat. She might step outside to check on the animals, or she might simply lie awake, talk quietly to her husband, say a prayer, and then drift back to sleep for her second shift, which would carry her through until dawn. I find something deeply unexpectedly poetic about that. In a world with no electricity, no screens, no notifications, the human body naturally built in a pause. A quiet, dark, private pause right in the middle of the night. just to breathe, to think, to exist. And then came daylight, and then came everything else. Now here is where Agnes's morning gets hard. Her second sleep ended not with an alarm but with light, the first thin grey light pushing through the gaps in the cottage door. Or sometimes with sound, the church bells ringing for matins, which was the earliest morning prayer service, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning for monks, though for ordinary people the dawn bell was more relevant. Agnes gets up. Her feet hit a dirt floor. Her one set of clothes is the same set she wore yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. She doesn't choose an outfit, she doesn't debate what to wear. She puts on what she has, and she moves. Her first job, and this is critical, is the fire. If the fire went out overnight, the whole day falls apart. No warm food, no way to heat water, no light in the darkness of winter mornings. And in the Middle Ages, fires were not easy to start. You didn't have a lighter, a match, nothing. You had a flint stone, a piece of metal and dry moss or tinder. On a damp morning that could take a very long time. So keeping the fire alive through the night wasn't just a household chore, it was survival management. We'll talk much more about this in our next part because the relationship between women and fire in history is one of the most overlooked and fascinating stories I've ever come across. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For Agnes, once the fire is going, once that first orange glow catches and spreads, she starts the porridge. A ceramic pot goes directly into the fire. Water, ground oats or barley or whatever grain they had stored from the last harvest. Sometimes dried herbs if they were lucky, salt if they could afford it. This porridge, by the way, was often the only warm meal of the day, and it was served in wooden bowls and washed down with something that sounds strange to modern ears, small beer, not the strong get-you-drunk kind. Small beer was a very lightly fermented grain drink, low in alcohol, maybe 1 or 2% brewed at home, mostly by women. Why did they drink beer for breakfast? Because the water was not safe. Rivers and wells in medieval villages were frequently contaminated. Waterborne illness was a quiet killer. But the process of brewing even lightly killed off enough bacteria to make small beer considerably safer than plain water. So Agnes's morning drink was technically beer. And honestly, I'm not here to judge. Some mornings that sounds just fine. Now let me shift the lens. Same time period, roughly the 13th to 15th century. But now we're not in a peasant cottage. We're in a manor house. A noblewoman, let's call her Lady Eleanor, is also waking up. But her morning looks absolutely nothing like Agnes's. Eleanor sleeps in an actual bed, with a wooden frame, a mattress stuffed with wool or feathers, linen sheets, perhaps a curtain around the bed to keep out draughts. She does not get up at dawn. She doesn't have to. She has servants, sometimes many of them, whose entire purpose is to make sure that when Eleanor opens her eyes, everything is already in motion. The fire in her chamber has been built up by a servant who rose before her. A wash basin of water, sometimes warmed, is waiting. Her clothing for the day has been laid out. Now does Eleanor's easier morning mean she had more freedom than Agnes? Here's where it gets interesting. Because in many ways, and historians argue about this a lot, the noblewoman's life was just as constrained, just differently constrained. Agnes worked her body into exhaustion every single day. But she had something Eleanor didn't, a kind of rough, practical independence. She made decisions constantly. She managed the food, the fire, the animals, the children. She knew exactly how things worked because if she didn't, things fell apart. Eleanor, on the other hand, was managed. What she wore, who she visited, who she married, what she read, every single thing was filtered through what was appropriate for a woman of her status. Her morning was comfortable, but her life was a gilded cage, and that tension between the woman who had nothing and everything to do and the woman who had everything and nothing to decide is the thread that runs through this entire story. Now let's jump forward. because I want to tell you about a specific moment in history, the 19th century, the Victorian era, where the gap between these two worlds reached its absolute extreme. And I want to give you one image that I think captures it perfectly. It is 7:30 in the morning, London around the year 1876. In a working-class neighbourhood, a woman named Mary has already been awake for over an hour and a half. She's a general servant, what they called in those days a maid-of-all-work, and her day began at 6 in the morning. According to historical household schedules from the era, her morning included lighting the kitchen fire, filling the kettles, sweeping the hall, cleaning the front steps, and laying the breakfast table, all before the family even opened their eyes. She does all of this alone, in the cold, before sunrise. At that exact same moment, 3 streets away, or perhaps 3 miles away in a wealthier neighbourhood, a woman of the upper class is just beginning to stir. Her lady's maid, her personal servant, gently knocks on the bedroom door. She carries a tray. On that tray, a small cup of hot tea, maybe a piece of dry toast. The lady does not get up immediately. She receives her tea in bed. She's then assisted step by careful step through the process of getting dressed. And this morning dressing ritual is something I need to describe to you properly, because it is unlike anything in the modern world. A Victorian upper-class woman did not simply get dressed. She was assembled. It began with a chemise, a simple white undergarment. Then came the corset laced tightly from behind by the maid. Then a crinoline or a bustle, a structural undergarment designed to make the skirt stand out in a very specific shape that was fashionable at the time. Then multiple petticoats, sometimes 4 or 5, layered underneath the outer skirt. Then the dress itself, often with dozens of buttons up the back, that the woman could not reach herself. Then gloves, then shoes, then hair which was pinned, coiled, and sometimes padded with hairpieces to achieve the desired volume. From start to finish, getting dressed could take anywhere from 45 minutes to well over an hour, and the woman could not do it alone. Think about that for a moment. She could not get dressed by herself. Now was this laziness? Absolutely not. It was a deliberate social design, because a woman who could not dress herself was a woman who could never fully leave without permission. She was structurally dependent. Built into her clothing was the requirement for another human being to exist nearby at all times. Her wardrobe wasn't just fashion, it was architecture, it was a system, and that system shaped her entire morning, her entire day, her entire sense of self. So here we are, 3 women, 3 mornings, 3 completely different worlds. Agnes rising in the dark, lighting a fire with her bare hands, making porridge for a family before the sun comes up. Lady Eleanor waking to a warm room and a ready wash basin, her day already organised by invisible labour around her. And the Victorian lady of 1876 assembled piece by piece into her social identity, while a maid in the kitchen 2 floors below has already cleaned 3 rooms, and every single one of them in their own way woke up into a world that had already decided what she was for, what her morning meant, what her day would hold, what her life would look like from the moment she opened her eyes until the moment she closed them again. And here's the question I want to leave you with right now as we step into the next part of this story. If the very first thing that happened to these women every single morning was shaped by someone else's rules, what happened when those rules started to change? Because the fire that Agnes lit every morning, metaphorically speaking, eventually spread. And the women who carried it forward did something remarkable in the most ordinary of places. The kitchen. Let's go there now. You know there is something almost meditative about a fire. The way it breathes, the way it pulls your eyes toward it and holds them there without asking permission. I think about this sometimes, and I wonder if the reason humans have always gathered around flames is not just for warmth. It is because fire is alive, and for thousands of years keeping that life going was a woman's job, not a suggestion, not a preference, a responsibility so serious, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that entire civilizations, literally entire civilizations, built their religions around it. And I want to start there, because I think this is one of the most overlooked and extraordinary chapters in the history of women. Let me take you to ancient Rome. Close your eyes for a second and imagine the Roman Forum, the beating heart of the most powerful city on earth at its peak. Marble columns, the sound of sandals on stone, the smell of incense drifting through the air, and right there at the centre of it all a small circular temple, not particularly large, not particularly grand compared to the temples around it, but there is something burning inside that temple that, according to the Romans, must never ever go out, the sacred flame of Vesta. This fire was not symbolic in a vague poetic sense. Romans genuinely believed with complete seriousness that if that flame died, Rome would fall, disaster would follow, harvest would fail, enemies would conquer. The entire fate of the empire resting in a single flickering fire. And who was responsible for keeping it alive? 6 women. Just 6. They were called the Vestal Virgins, chosen as young girls, sometimes as young as 6 years old, selected from the most prominent families in Rome by the chief priest himself. Once chosen, a girl was immediately separated from her family. She would serve for 30 years. 30 years of her life dedicated entirely to a flame. And the rules governing these women were absolute. If a Vestal allowed the fire to go out not through malice, not through sabotage, simply through a moment of inattention, she was stripped and beaten for letting a fire die. There is one recorded incident from the year 206 before our Common Era, described by the ancient historian Livy, where a novice Vestal allowed the flame to go out. The panic in the city was immediate. People in the streets were described as being seized with what Livy called terror. Not annoyance, not frustration. Terror, as if the walls of the city had begun to crack. Now I want you to hold that image for a moment, because what strikes me every time I read about the Vestals is this strange, almost painful contradiction. These 6 women were in many ways the most powerful women in ancient Rome. They could own property. They could make legal wills. They could give testimony in court without swearing an oath, a privilege not even extended to senators. If a condemned prisoner happened to cross paths with a Vestal on the way to his execution, he was automatically pardoned, just by proximity. Julius Caesar himself, yes, that Julius Caesar was once on a death list drawn up by the dictator Sulla. It was the Vestal Virgins who interceded on his behalf and saved his life. The man who would eventually reshape the entire Roman world alive because 6 women who tended a fire spoke up for him. And yet those same women were not allowed to choose their own lives. They were not allowed to marry during their service. They were not allowed to leave. And if a Vestal was ever accused of breaking her vow of chastity, the punishment was not imprisonment, not exile. She was buried alive, dressed in funeral clothing, placed in an underground chamber with a small lamp, a little bread, a little water. The entrance sealed above her, left to the dark. Now only a handful of Vestals were ever put to death this way in the order's more than 1,000 years of existence. And historians note that such trials often coincided with political crises, the Vestals sometimes used as convenient scapegoats when Rome needed someone to blame for its troubles. But the punishment existed. The threat was real. And I think the Vestal Virgins represent something profound and deeply human, this ancient recurring pattern where society places enormous symbolic importance on women, elevates them to near sacred status, and then controls them absolutely. The fire they tended was eternal. Their freedom was not. Now here is the part of this story that I find genuinely surprising, and I think you will too. That connection between women and fire was not unique to Rome. It was not unique to the ancient world. It continued quietly for centuries. Jump forward to medieval England. The woman we met in our last section, Agnes the peasant waking before dawn in her cold cottage, her relationship to fire was not symbolic. It was entirely practical. But it carried the same weight, because in a medieval household the hearth fire was the engine of everything. It cooked the food, it heated the water, it dried wet clothes, it provided the only light during the long dark months of winter. It kept the family warm in a time when cold could kill. And it was Agnes's responsibility. Every morning before anything else happened, before the children woke, before her husband stirred, Agnes needed that fire going. Here is something that most people today don't appreciate. Starting a fire from nothing in a medieval cottage was not quick. You had a piece of iron, a flint stone, and a small bundle of dry tinder, maybe dried moss, shredded bark, or the scraped powder from the inside of an old rope. On a dry summer morning you might coax a spark into a flame in a few minutes. On a damp winter morning with cold fingers and wet air, it could take much, much longer. So the smartest strategy, the one that every experienced housewife knew, was to never let it go out in the first place. Before going to sleep, Agnes would carefully bank the fire, push the embers together, cover them with a thick layer of ash, sometimes add a piece of slow-burning peat, or a dense log. This was called smoring, the fire in parts of Scotland and Ireland, and the ritual of smoring passed down through generations of women, sometimes included a spoken blessing or prayer, pressing the coals into the shape of a circle divided into 3 sections, each section for a different member of the Holy Trinity, or a different protection for the home, a fire management technique with prayer built into it, a daily routine that was also a spiritual practice. I find that beautiful. But here is what happened as a result of those long hours Agnes spent managing the fire, preparing grains, watching pots, stirring, timing, adjusting heat without a thermometer, without a recipe card, simply with the knowledge stored in her hands. She became extraordinarily skilled. And those skills, specifically the skills of brewing, turned out to be the foundation of something that most people today have never connected to women at all. Let me ask you something. When you picture the history of beer, and I know that might not be a thing you picture regularly, which is completely fair, but when you do, who do you imagine made it? Monks in a monastery, industrial factories, men with large barrels, almost certainly not a medieval woman standing at a hearth in her kitchen. But that is exactly where beer came from. The drink that sustained medieval Europe was for centuries made almost entirely by women, not occasionally, not as a hobby, exclusively, systematically, professionally. There was even a specific word for them: brewsters, or alewives, and the reason is so logical it almost makes you laugh once you hear it. Brewing ale requires a large pot, a heat source, knowledge of fermentation, timing, and grain management. Every woman who ran a medieval household already had all of those things. She already ground grain every day for bread. She already managed a fire. She already understood through years of practice how heat affected ingredients over time. Brewing was just an extension of what she was already doing. Records from English towns in the 13th and 14th centuries show that brewing was considered legally and socially a female profession. In the town of Brigstock, one study found that nearly 3/4 of all known ale sellers during that period were married women, not single women, not widows but wives who brewed as part of their contribution to the household economy. One estimate suggests that a typical medieval family of 5 needed roughly 9 gallons of ale per week. 9 gallons. Because ale wasn't drunk for the pleasure of getting intoxicated, it was drunk because it was safer than water. The fermentation process, even lightly done, killed enough waterborne bacteria to make ale considerably more reliable than whatever was coming out of the local river or well. Women brewed it. Women sold the surplus to neighbours. Women ran makeshift alehouses out of their own homes. And if you wanted to find one, if you walked through a medieval English town looking for a place to buy ale, you looked for a broom hung over a front door. A broom. That simple domestic tool, the symbol of a woman's work, hung as a sign of commerce. Women even adopted tall pointed hats to stand out in crowded markets so buyers could spot them. Does that image ring any bells? A woman, a pointed hat, a broom. Historians have noted with considerable dry humour that many of the visual symbols we associate with witches today were actually the professional branding of medieval female brewers. The cauldron, that was her brewing pot. The cat kept to protect the grain stores from mice. The hat a market visibility strategy. The image of the witch, it turns out, may be at least partly the image of a working medieval businesswoman, repackaged as something sinister, once men decided they wanted control of the brewing industry. Because that is exactly what happened. By the 15th and 16th centuries, as brewing became more profitable and commercially organised male-run guilds began pushing women out, they changed the laws. They spread rumours about dishonest alewives and immoral brewsters. In 1540, the city of Chester actually issued a formal decree banning women between the ages of 14 and 40 from selling ale, citing with breathtaking audacity their concern that attractive women would spread immorality. So women didn't lose the brewing industry because they were bad at it. They lost it because they were good at it. Good enough that it became worth taking. And standing at the centre of all of it, both in ancient Rome and in medieval England, separated by over 1,000 years, and an entire civilization, was a fire, tended by a woman's hands, first thing in the morning, every single morning. There is a line I keep coming back to, written by historian Judith Bennett, who spent much of her career studying medieval women and work. She described the female brewers of medieval England as not just domestic workers, but as genuine economic actors, women who took the tools of their daily routine and quietly built something larger than anyone expected. That phrase, the tools of their daily routine, has stayed with me, because I think that is true of so many women throughout history. They were handed a fire to tend, and they found ways to use it. Now there is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move on. That fire Agnes lit every morning. It did not stay in the hearth. Later, in a world completely different from hers, dressed in a very different kind of clothing, bound by a very different set of rules, women were still managing invisible flames, different fires, more contained ones that burned not in kitchens but in ledgers, in letters, in the quiet calculations happening behind closed doors, because the morning didn't end at the hearth. After the fire was set, after the porridge was made, after the ale was attended to, there was the rest of the house to manage. And the way women managed it, the invisible architecture of domestic economy that ran entirely on female labour and female intelligence, is its own remarkable story. One we are stepping into right now. So here's a question I genuinely want you to sit with for a moment. Imagine you are standing in a room. A beautiful room, high ceilings, tall windows letting in the pale morning light of an English autumn. And someone hands you a book. Not a novel, not a story, but a book telling you exactly who you are, what you are worth, and what you're supposed to do from the moment you open your eyes until the moment you close them at night. 1,112 pages of it. That book existed. It was published on the 1st day of October in the year 1861, and its title was almost comically straightforward, The Book of Household Management, written by a 25-year-old woman named Isabella Beeton. And before you think this is a story about a dusty old cookbook, I need you to understand something. This book sold 60,000 copies in its very first year. By 1868, just 7 years later, it had sold nearly 2 million. 2 million. In an era with no internet, no social media, no algorithms pushing it to the top of anyone's feed, that number tells you everything about how hungry Victorian women were for something, anything that acknowledged the sheer complexity of what they did every single day. Because here is what most people don't realize about the Victorian housewife. She was not simply a woman who cooked and cleaned. She was in the truest and most complete sense of the word a manager. Mrs. Beeton understood this. She opens her book not with a recipe, but with a declaration that reads almost like a job description for a small corporation. She writes, and I am paraphrasing here to preserve the spirit of it, that the mistress of a household is like the commander of an army. She must understand the character and capacities of every person under her authority. She must plan, direct, and oversee. She must be knowledgeable about every department under her roof. And then in the very first pages of a book that would shape the domestic lives of millions of women, she lists the single most important quality a woman could have. Not kindness, not patience, not beauty, early rising. Specifically, she writes that early rising is one of the most essential qualities which enter into good household management, and that when a mistress is an early riser, her house will almost certainly be orderly and well managed. I read that, and I think here it is again. The alarm that was never really an alarm. The clock that ran on obligation. But what strikes me even more is what happens after that Victorian lady rises and dresses, because once she was upright and clothed, her real work began. And it was work that history has systematically undervalued, even though it required skills that the modern world would recognize instantly if they appeared on a business card. Let me walk you through a morning. It is 9:30. She has been up for 2 hours. The house is already in motion around her, managed by a staff whose size depends entirely on her family's income. Perhaps just one maid of all work in a modest household, or a full hierarchy of cook, housekeeper, footman and lady's maid in a grander one. But here is the thing: the presence of servants did not mean she had nothing to do. It meant she had to manage them. And managing people, directing their work, maintaining their morale, resolving their disputes, monitoring their honesty, is one of the most demanding forms of labour that exists. Mrs. Beeton is very clear about this. After breakfast, she writes, the mistress should make a round of the kitchen and other rooms to see that the morning's work has been properly performed. She should give orders for the day, answer any questions from the staff, and hand out whatever supplies they require from the store cupboard. The store cupboard. This is a detail that gets almost no attention in popular culture, but I find it fascinating. In a well-run Victorian household, the mistress held the key to the storeroom literally. Sugar, tea, spices, coffee. These were expensive commodities, and they were kept locked away under the lady's personal control. She decided what was used when and in what quantity. She tracked the accounts daily, recording every expenditure in a household ledger that she maintained herself. She planned the menus for the week, calculated the costs, and negotiated with tradespeople and suppliers. And she did all of this while also receiving callers, writing correspondence, supervising the children's lessons, managing the laundry rotation, overseeing the seasonal deep cleaning, and if she was particularly diligent, reading up on any domestic matter she felt she needed to improve. Does that sound like a life of leisure to you? Because it doesn't to me. What I find most striking about this invisible economy, and I think it is genuinely one of history's most overlooked stories, is how deliberately it was made to look like nothing. The language used to describe women's work at home was designed to make it sound natural, instinctive, effortless, as if it simply happened the way the sun rises without thought or skill or exhaustion. But the numbers tell a different story. A middle-class Victorian household in the 1860s might spend between £300 and £800 per year on domestic expenses that is the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. Someone was tracking every penny of that. Someone was making dozens of financial decisions every week. Someone was running what was functionally a small private enterprise. That someone wore a dress with 6 layers under it and was not allowed to vote. And now here is the angle on this that I keep turning over in my mind. Isabella Beeton, the woman who wrote the Great Manual of Victorian Domestic Management, was not herself a comfortable established housewife with years of experience. She was 21 years old when she started the project. She compiled the book between her pregnancies. She had never trained professionally in cookery or household administration. She gathered recipes from readers of her husband's magazine, tested them in her own kitchen, and organized them with a precision and methodology that no one had applied to domestic knowledge before. She died at the age of 28. 4 children, 4 pregnancies in 4 years. Her book outlasted her by over a century. It is still in print today. And here is what that tells me: the knowledge that Victorian women were expected to carry in their heads, the planning, the budgeting, the managing, the knowing was so vast and so complex that it filled over 1,000 pages when someone finally bothered to write it down. Now I want to shift our lens one more time, because while we've been talking about the Victorian lady and her household ledger and her locked store cupboard, there is another woman I want you to meet. She exists at the exact same moment in history. She lives perhaps a mile away. She also gets dressed in the morning, but her relationship to clothing tells a completely different story about power and constraint. Let me be specific about what a Victorian woman's dressing process actually involved, because I think most people today significantly underestimate it. It began with drawers, 2 entirely separate fabric legs joined only at the waistband with the centre seam left open. Not for fashion. For practicality, once a woman was fully dressed, taking everything off simply to use the chamber pot was not a reasonable option. The clothing itself had to accommodate the body's basic needs, because the body could not accommodate the clothing. Over the drawers came the chemise, a loose cotton undershirt designed not for the woman's comfort, but to protect the corset from her sweat, and the corset from chafing her skin, and then the corset. Now the corset has become one of history's most debated garments, and I want to be fair here because the history is more complicated than it is often presented. Not every woman was laced to the point of agony. The extreme tight lacing that gets so much attention, the 17-inch waists, the theatrical gasping, that was more a fringe practice than a daily norm. Most women's corsets were tightened to a reasonable degree, and many Victorian women genuinely felt more comfortable and supported wearing one than not. But here is what is undeniable: the corset required another person to help you put it on properly. Specifically, it required someone to stand behind you and manage the lacing. For the upper classes, that person was the lady's maid. For middle-class women, it might be a sister, a friend, a shared servant. For working women who could afford none of those, and this is the part that rarely gets discussed, they made do with front-fastening versions, or they managed with a looser fit, or they simply endured the difficulty. What does it mean to begin every single day of your adult life with a physical act you cannot complete alone? That question sat in the back of my mind for a long time, before I could articulate why it unsettled me. And then I realized it is not just about clothing. It is about what that dependency was designed to produce. A woman who cannot dress herself independently is in a very quiet and mundane way. A woman who is reminded every morning that she requires assistance to move through the world. Not dramatically, not with any single grand gesture of control, but structurally, daily, before she has even had her tea. Over the chemise and corset came a corset cover to smooth the lines. Then the petticoats, anywhere from 3 to 6 of them in the 1840s and 1850s, before the cage crinoline arrived in the mid-1850s and reduced that number somewhat. Then the dress itself, often with dozens of small buttons up the back that required either a special hook tool or again another pair of hands. Then gloves, then a hat or bonnet secured with pins. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which holds one of the world's great collections of historical dress documents. One reconstruction of dressing Queen Victoria in a morning gown from the 1840s, just getting the corset properly fitted took around 20 minutes. Just the corset, 20 minutes, every morning, and then she ran an empire. I mean that both literally and figuratively. There is one more thing I want to say before we move forward, and it is something that I think is genuinely worth holding in your mind. The women who endured all of this, the layers, the structure, the physical restriction, the daily dependency, they did not simply accept it passively. Some of them fought back, quietly, from within the system itself, using the only tools they were given. A dress reform movement began gaining momentum in the 1850s and 1860s. Women physicians, yes, there were some despite enormous resistance, began publishing arguments that corsets were contributing to difficult childbirth, compressed organs, and chronic illness. One physician, writing with a dry wit that I deeply admire, suggested that no woman should wear a corset for, as she put it, 200 years before pregnancy takes place. They were not always listened to, but they kept writing, they kept arguing, they kept documenting. Because documentation, putting the invisible labour, the invisible suffering, the invisible knowledge of women's lives into words, turned out to be one of the most powerful acts of resistance available. Isabella Beeton knew that. The dress reformers knew that. And as we continue through this day, this long-layered, extraordinary day in the lives of women from the past, you are going to see that pattern again and again. Women who found ways to make their invisible work visible. Women who turned the tools of their daily routine into something larger than the routine itself. We're about to step out of the bedroom and into the morning proper, and the place we're walking into next, the quiet, complex, politically charged space of the Victorian household, has a story that I think will genuinely surprise you. Right around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something shifted in the Victorian household. The morning's correspondence was finished. The household accounts had been reviewed. The housekeeper had received her orders for dinner, and now, in that particular window between luncheon and the early evening, the real social machinery of Victorian women's lives began to move. It started with a small rectangular piece of card, about 9 centimetres wide and 6 centimetres tall, engraved with a name, nothing more. And I want to tell you that this tiny piece of paper, this thing that could fit in the palm of your hand, was one of the most sophisticated social technologies ever invented. Because in the hands of a Victorian woman, a calling card was not just paper, it was power. Let me back up for a moment, because to understand what the calling card actually meant, you have to understand the world it operated in. Victorian society, at least in its upper and middle class layers, had no telephone, no email, no text message that you could dash off in 30 seconds to say you were thinking of someone, or to decline an invitation, or to make your feelings known. Everything that passed between people socially had to be conducted in person in writing, or through the precise choreography of the calling card system. And that system was governed by rules so intricate, so layered with meaning, that entire books were published just to explain them. One etiquette guide from the 1890s describes the calling card this way, and I love this quote because it captures everything. To the unrefined or unbred, the visiting card is but a trifling and insignificant bit of paper, but to the cultured disciple of social law, it conveys a subtle and unmistakable intelligence. Subtle and unmistakable intelligence. On a piece of card the size of your phone. Now here is where it gets fascinating. The card and call system was designed at its core to solve a specific social problem. How do you build and maintain relationships in a world where showing up unannounced at someone's door was considered extraordinarily rude? The answer was the ritual of the call, the A woman who wished to enter a new social circle or maintain an existing one would set out in the early afternoon, usually between 3 and 5 o'clock, dressed appropriately, often in her carriage, and she would call on her acquaintances, not to have a long conversation, not to stay for hours. A morning call which somewhat confusingly could take place at any time before dinner lasted between 15 and 20 minutes. Just 15 to 20 minutes. You arrived, you were announced, you kept your bonnet and gloves on to signal that this was a brief formal visit. You made polite conversation, and then when you sensed a natural pause or when another caller arrived or when your time was up, you left. If the lady of the house was not receiving visitors that day, you did not get through the door at all. Her servant would meet you at the entrance, accept your card, and deliver the 4 words that every Victorian social caller both dreaded and wielded: "Not at home." Now, and this is the part I think is genuinely brilliant, "not at home" did not necessarily mean the woman was actually out. She might be sitting 20 feet away in her drawing room, perfectly aware you were at the door. Not at home was a socially accepted fiction. A graceful way of declining a visit without the embarrassment of a direct refusal. The etiquette guides of the era are perfectly clear about this. One Victorian manual explains that the phrase may be understood in different senses, but the only courteous way is to receive them as being perfectly true. In other words, everyone knew it might be a polite lie, and everyone agreed to pretend otherwise. Let me ask you something. Does that remind you of anything in your own life? The text you read but didn't answer right away. The social media post you saw but chose not to respond to. The email marked as urgent that you've been thinking about for 3 days. We did not invent the selective availability. Victorian women had it figured out 200 years ago. They just encoded it into a phrase delivered by a servant. But the real sophistication was in the card itself, because the card communicated far more than just the name engraved on it. Etiquette guides from the period document an elaborate system of folded corners, each fold carrying a distinct meaning understood by anyone in polite society. A folded top left corner meant the visitor had come in person, not sent the card by a servant. That small gesture conveyed respect, it said. I valued this enough to come myself. A folded bottom left corner meant farewell. The caller was leaving town perhaps for the season, and this was her way of saying goodbye. A folded top right corner offered congratulations, perhaps for a birth, a marriage, a social advancement. A folded bottom right corner expressed condolence. And if a card was returned to you sent back by the recipient that was not a mistake, that was a message. Clear, unambiguous, devastating. You had been cut. No confrontation, no argument, no explanation required. Just a card sent back in an envelope communicating in the most civilized possible way that this relationship was over. I find something almost theatrical about that. The precision of it, the way an entire emotional reality, affection, rejection, congratulation, farewell could be transmitted through the angle of a fold. Now the silver card tray in the entrance hall of a Victorian home was, as one historian has beautifully put it, the social media of its day. When visitors arrived, they left their cards in that tray, and those cards were visible to everyone else who called afterward. This was not accidental. A tray displaying the cards of influential, prestigious, or fashionable visitors was a form of social currency. It said, "Look who has been here. Look whose company this household keeps. Look how well connected we are." And correspondingly, a tray with no notable names or with cards from the wrong sort of people told its own story. Victorian women understood this perfectly. They managed their card trays the way a modern social media manager curates a public profile: what to display, what to move quietly to the back, whose name to make visible and whose to receive privately away from public view. This was a woman's work, her domain, her decisions. In a world that denied women formal political power, legal independence, or professional authority, the social network was the arena where women exercised genuine influence, and they were extraordinarily good at it. Lady Colin Campbell, who published a widely read guide to society etiquette in the 1892, wrote something that has stayed with me. She explains that you could not invite people to your home, however often you may have met them elsewhere, until you had first formally called on them and they had returned the call. That one rule alone tells you everything about how the system worked. It was not enough to like someone. It was not enough to have met them at a dinner or a concert or a garden party. Before you could invite someone into your private space, before you could seat them at your table and offer them your hospitality, there had to be this formal, ritualized exchange of calls. First she calls on you, then you return the call. Then and only then do you begin to exist in each other's social lives. Skip a step and the whole structure collapsed. Return a call too late and you had given offence. Fail to return it at all, and the message was unmistakable. It was a system that ran entirely on female labour, on women's time, women's attention, women's careful navigation of relationship and reputation, and it regulated who belonged in society and who did not. And here is the angle I find genuinely provocative. Women were not supposed to be interested in politics. Victorian etiquette guides are famously explicit about this. When gentlemen converse with ladies, they were advised to avoid topics such as politics, science, or commerce, and choose instead topics ladies were likely to be interested in. Which is condescending in a way that makes my jaw tighten even now. But here is what those gentlemen did not fully appreciate. The women who are busy paying afternoon calls and managing card trays and deciding who got invited to dinner and who received a returned card, those women were doing politics. Not in Parliament, not in the newspapers, but in the drawing rooms and the entry halls and the carefully timed rounds of afternoon visits. They were building alliances, managing reputations, controlling access. A woman who chose to receive a new family to call on them first, to offer her card to invite them into her social circle, could open doors that money alone could not buy. A woman who chose not to, who instructed her servant to say, "Not at home," every time a certain caller arrived, could quietly, efficiently, and visibly end a family's social aspirations. No confrontation required, just a card that was never returned. There is one more dimension to this that I want to spend a moment on because I think it is the most underappreciated aspect of the whole system. The calling card and the afternoon visit were almost exclusively a woman's domain. Men were at their offices, their clubs, their estates. Men had their own channels of connection, business luncheons, club memberships, professional networks. But the social network, the web of family relationships, personal alliances, charitable connections, and community standing that held Victorian upper and middle class society together, that web was woven entirely by women, in the afternoons, between 3 and 5 o'clock, with a small engraved card and 15 minutes of carefully managed conversation. And I think we should sit with that for a moment, because it means that the stability, the cohesion, the social fabric of an entire civilization, one of the most powerful and far-reaching in human history, depended on work that was never counted, never compensated, and rarely even acknowledged. When historians write about Victorian England, they write about industry and empire and parliament and invention. The women who made it possible to hold any of that together, who maintained the relationships between families, who managed the social integrations of new wealth and old rank, who decided which alliances formed and which dissolved, rarely appear by name. They appear, if at all, as wives, as hostesses, as background figures in someone else's story. But they were running something real, something that mattered enormously, and the instrument they used to run it was so small you could lose it in a coat pocket. Now here is where the afternoon began its slow turn towards something else. Because as those calling hours wound down as the last visitor departed, and the drawing room fell quiet, a different kind of preparation began. One that required an entirely different kind of performance. Tea was coming, and while tea sounds simple, a hot drink, a few biscuits, nothing dramatic, the ritual of afternoon tea in Victorian England was anything but simple. It was in fact the hour that one woman invented almost by accident in the year 1840, and it changed the social lives of women across the entire Western world. That story, and the quiet, extraordinary power it handed to women who knew how to use it, is exactly where we are heading next. Picture a woman sitting in her room at Belvoir Castle sometime around the year 1840. She's not particularly hungry, not unwell, not upset about anything dramatic. She simply has that feeling, that vague, hollow, restless sensation that comes in the mid-afternoon when lunch was hours ago and dinner still feels impossibly far away. She calls it quite precisely a sinking feeling. Her name is Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, and she is one of Queen Victoria's closest companions, a lady of the bedchamber, a woman who moves at the very centre of English aristocratic life. Her solution to this sinking feeling is modest, almost embarrassingly simple. She asked for a tray, tea, bread and butter, perhaps a small cake, brought to her room, quietly, privately. That is it. That is the whole origin story. And yet from that single private tray in a Leicestershire castle, something emerged that would reshape the afternoon lives of women across the entire Western world, spread from aristocratic drawing rooms into middle-class parlours across the Atlantic, and eventually become one of the most recognisable rituals in the English-speaking world. Afternoon tea, born from hunger, built into an institution. Now I want to be honest with you, because this is one of those historical stories where the neat origin myth bumps up against a messier reality, and I think the messier reality is actually more interesting. Historians have debated the Duchess of Bedford's claim to invention. Tea in the afternoon was already being served in Georgian spa towns like Bath and Harrogate in the 1750s and 1760s, decades before the Duchess rang her bell for a tray. Queen Victoria herself in her private diaries describes taking afternoon tea in a way that suggests it was already a familiar custom, calling it on one occasion tea in the German way, with no particular credit given to her friend the Duchess. So did Anna Maria Russell actually invent afternoon tea? Probably not in the strict sense. What she did, and this I think is far more interesting, was take a private informal habit and transform it into a deliberate social event. She began inviting friends to join her for that afternoon tray. She moved it from the bedchamber to the drawing room. She gave it structure, and in giving it structure she gave it power, because here is what happened next. The Duchess was a close friend of Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria, who recorded references to tea parties over 7,000 times in her personal diaries over the course of her long reign, became an enthusiast. With royal approval in place, afternoon tea moved from an aristocratic habit to a fashionable institution with remarkable speed. By the 1860s, it was deeply embedded in upper-class English life. By the 1870s and 1880s, hotels like the Langham and Claridge's were offering afternoon tea as a public service, opening the ritual to anyone who could afford it. Within a few decades, what began as one duchess's personal solution to afternoon hunger had become a cultural touchstone that defined an entire civilization's relationship with the middle part of the day. But here is the question I actually want to explore. Why tea? Why did this particular ritual, a hot drink, some small food, a specific time of day, take on such enormous social significance? Why didn't it stay a private snack in someone's bedroom? The answer, I think, has everything to do with what the tea table actually was. In the Victorian era, a woman could not go to a gentleman's club. She could not attend parliamentary debates. She could not go to a professional dinner unaccompanied or conduct business openly, or join the networks of influence that men accessed through their professional and institutional lives. But she could pour tea, and the tea table, that low, beautifully arranged surface with its fine china and silver teapot and delicate sandwiches, was entirely her territory. She chose who was invited. She chose the seating. She poured, which meant she decided who received first, who received most, whose cup was refilled attentively, and whose was quietly not. She directed the conversation. She set the emotional temperature of the room. This was not decoration. This was not merely domestic charm. This was the operation of soft power in its most refined and effective form, and anyone who has ever been at a table where a skilled host holds the room, where every guest somehow feels simultaneously welcomed and slightly uncertain about their standing, knows exactly what I am describing. Now here is where I want to pull the camera back and look at something much bigger. Because the English afternoon tea table was not in world historical terms a unique phenomenon. It was one iteration of something that women across different cultures had been doing for centuries, claiming a particular time, a particular ritual, a particular domestic space, and quietly filling it with real influence. In France, they called it the salon, and if afternoon tea was the English version of women's social power, the French salon was something altogether more radical, more explicitly intellectual, and I would argue more politically consequential than anything that happened over cucumber sandwiches. Let me tell you about a woman named Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin. Born in Paris in 1699, orphaned at 7, married off at 15 to a man 33 years her senior. By most measures of her time, her prospects were not remarkable. And yet by the middle of the 18th century, Madame Geoffrin, as she became known, was running the most important intellectual gathering in Europe. Her salon at number 372 on the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris was attended by Montesquieu, Diderot, d'Alembert, Voltaire, and the philosophers whose ideas would eventually ignite the French Revolution. Among her correspondents were Empress Catherine II of Russia, King Stanislaus Augustus of Poland, and Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, 3 of the most powerful monarchs in the world, writing letters to a woman who technically held no office, no title by birth, no formal power of any kind. Her formula was brilliant in its apparent simplicity. She hosted 2 dinners every week, one on Mondays for writers, one on Wednesdays for artists. She provided excellent food, good wine, and this is the part I love, she reserved the right to interrupt any conversation that was going in an unproductive direction. Her signature phrase when things got too heated or too self-indulgent was "Voilà qui est bien," roughly translatable as "that is quite enough of that." She would simply say it pleasantly firmly and the conversation would pivot. The most brilliant minds of the European Enlightenment redirected by a woman with a phrase. One historian described the French salonières as power brokers who few could afford to ignore. They were in the fullest sense curators of ideas. They decided who was introduced to whom, whose manuscript was read aloud, whose reputation was made or quietly unmade. Many of the great works of the Enlightenment, including parts of the Encyclopédie, that monumental project of the 18th century, were refined, promoted, and financially supported through the salon network that women had built and maintained. Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously was opposed to the whole enterprise. He believed women should stay out of intellectual life. He thought their presence would corrupt serious discourse. He was also a regular guest at several of the most prominent salons. Even the men who disagreed with women's influence attended their gatherings, because you could not afford not to. Now I want to draw a line between all of this, the French salon, the English tea table, and something that I think gets overlooked in conversations about women and history. There is a tendency to frame the story of women's influence in the past as a story of absence. Women were not in Parliament. Women were not in universities. Women were not on the battlefield or in the counting house. And all of that is true. But absence from the formal institutions of power does not mean absence from power itself. It means the power was operating somewhere else, in a room where tea was poured, at a table where who sat where mattered, in a conversation that was guided, shaped, and sometimes redirected by a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. I find myself thinking often about Madame Geoffrin's phrase, "Voilà qui est bien," that is quite enough, said pleasantly, said firmly, by a woman who had no legal authority, no political office, no institutional standing. And yet when she said it, the room obeyed. That is a form of mastery that deserves a great deal more recognition than it typically receives. Let me share one more detail before we move forward. Queen Victoria's tea diary habit, those 7,000 references to tea parties across her journals, was not casual documentation. Victoria was meticulous about her social gatherings in a way that reflects the deeper Victorian understanding of hospitality as governance. Who came to tea at court, who was invited, who was not, who was seated near the Queen, and who was placed further away, these were political signals read carefully by everyone who received or failed to receive an invitation. The tea table was a stage, and the woman who presided over it was always in some sense performing, not insincerely, not manipulatively, but with full awareness that every gesture, every arrangement, every choice of who received the first cup carried meaning beyond the merely social. And this is the thought I want you to carry into the next part of this story. Because as the afternoon wound toward evening, as the tea things were cleared away and the house began to prepare for the grandest performance of the Victorian day, everything we have talked about so far was just the rehearsal. Dinner was coming, and at the Victorian dinner table the layers of meaning of performance of power and constraint and hidden danger reached a level that I think will genuinely surprise you. The table was set, the candles were lit, and underneath it all, something no one in that elegant room could see, women were sometimes slowly, quietly paying a very different kind of price, just to look beautiful under the candlelight. That story begins right now. There is a painting I keep thinking about. It hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. You have probably seen it, even if you do not immediately know its name. A woman in an off-shoulder black evening gown standing in three-quarter profile, her skin luminous and impossibly pale, the single strap of her dress slipping from her shoulder, in a way that caused a genuine scandal when the painting was first exhibited in Paris in 1884. Her name was Virginie Gautreau, an American-born Parisian socialite, and the painter was John Singer Sargent. The painting is called Madame X. What most people who admire it do not know what most people standing in that gallery, with their coffee cups and audio guides, would never guess is the reality behind that extraordinary complexion. That cadaver-pale skin, that quality of luminous, almost supernatural whiteness. It came from an arsenic-laden enamel she painted onto her skin. Not powder, not foundation, enamel. And because the substance was rigid when it dried, Madame Gautreau, like many women of her era, who used similar preparations, had to be extremely careful not to be too expressive during the long hours of an evening. She could not laugh too hard, could not raise her eyebrows too dramatically, could not let her face do the full range of things human faces naturally do, because if she did, the enamel would crack. So she stood beautifully, dangerously still. And I think that image, a woman choosing to wear something she knew was slowly damaging her, standing motionless so the surface would not fracture, is one of the most perfect metaphors I've ever encountered for the Victorian dinner party. Beautiful, rigid, concealing everything beneath the surface. Let me walk you through the evening. Dinner in a Victorian upper-class household was not served at 6 in the evening the way many of us eat today. It was served at 8, sometimes 9. The gap between afternoon tea and dinner was filled with a period of preparation so elaborate that it constituted in many households a third significant dressing of the day. The morning dress was gone. The afternoon visiting dress was gone. Now came the evening gown, lower cut, more elaborate, accompanied by jewellery, long gloves, and a level of formal presentation that made the morning routine look almost casual by comparison. It was the third time that day a woman of any standing had been partially assembled by someone else. Third time. By the time she descended the staircase toward the drawing room, she'd been dressed, undressed, and redressed. She had managed a household, received callers, presided over tea, and she was still visibly, effortlessly, impeccably performing. Now the drawing room before dinner was its own little theatre. Guests gathered there, first the ladies and gentlemen making conversation, the hostess circulating the host, quietly managing the logistics of who would escort whom to the table. Because the procession to the dining room was not casual, it was choreographed. The hostess would discreetly let each gentleman know which lady he would escort to dinner. This was done quietly in advance, so there would be no awkward confusion at the moment of announcement. When dinner was finally called, the couples formed up and processed through the host, leading the most honoured female guest, the gentleman of highest precedence, escorting the hostess in a precise order, determined by rank and social standing. One etiquette guide of the period notes with admirable seriousness that when the company was distinguished, the host would do well to consult published tables of nobility before arranging the seating. Published tables of nobility, consulted before placing people at a dinner table. I want you to appreciate how seriously this was taken. A woman who found herself seated too far from the host, or next to someone of markedly lower status than herself, could interpret it as a deliberate social slight. Feelings were hurt, tempers quietly flared, grudges were nursed over soup courses, and here is one of the details I find genuinely funny. In a very Victorian sort of way, husbands and wives were always separated at the table. Always. Seated as far from each other as the table would allow. The reasoning, as one American etiquette manual from 1890 put it, was that being together always they ought not to converse among themselves at a general party. In other words, you see each other at home every day. Tonight you are social assets to be deployed separately, which when you think about it is either extremely pragmatic or slightly ruthless depending on the quality of your marriage. Once seated, the performance continued. Every aspect of dinner, what you ate, how much you ate, how you responded to the food, how you held your silverware, how you spoke, was governed by rules so detailed that they fill entire chapters of Victorian etiquette books. You are not, for example, supposed to comment enthusiastically on the food. That might seem strange to modern ears. We go to dinner and the food is often literally the main topic of conversation. But Victorian dinner etiquette demanded that the dishes be received with restrained acknowledgement, as if excellent food were simply the expected baseline rather than something worth remarking on. An etiquette guide from the period warns its readers to eat enormously as disgusting, but if you eat too sparingly, your host may think you despise his fare. There is a needle-threading precision to that instruction that I find oddly relatable. Eat enough to honour the host, not so much that anyone notices. Say enough to be agreeable, not so much that you become the centre of attention. Be present, be charming, be utterly invisibly controlled. Sound familiar? Now let us come back to that subject I raised at the end of our last section, because I promised you a story that would genuinely surprise you. The candles were lit, the silver gleamed, the women were dressed in their evening gowns, and underneath some of those extraordinary complexions in those ornate bottles arranged on bedroom dressing tables, in those recipes shared between women through magazines and household manuals, was a collection of ingredients that if you encountered them today would send you immediately to the nearest medical facility. Lead, mercury, arsenic, And I want to be careful how I tell this story because it is easy to make Victorian women sound naive when the reality was considerably more complicated than that. Let us start with lead. White lead-based cosmetics have been used since ancient times. They appear in the makeup of ancient Egyptian women, in the skin preparations of ancient Rome, in the elaborate court cosmetics of the Renaissance. By the Victorian era, lead had technically been classified as a poison under English law since 1631. 1631, 230 years before the height of the Victorian era, and yet lead-based face preparations were still being sold, still being used, still appearing in beauty columns and household remedy books throughout the 19th century, because the cosmetic effect was genuinely difficult to replicate otherwise. Lead gave the skin a smooth, opaque, extraordinarily pale appearance that no harmless alternative could quite match. And pale skin, that quality of never having been touched by sun, never having done outdoor work, was the most visible signal of upper-class status available. Women who wanted to look the part used what worked. The problem was the cycle it created. Lead-based preparations were corrosive to the skin over time. They caused damage, discoloration, scarring. And women who experienced this damage did what seemed logical. They applied more preparation to cover the damage, which caused more damage, which required more coverage, which caused more damage. One contemporary writer described it with a vividness that makes you wince. Thick layers of face paste that would literally crack if the wearer was too expressive. Women arriving at dinner parties who had to manage not just their conversation, but the physical integrity of their own faces. Mercury was another fixture in Victorian beauty columns. An 1874 piece in Harper's Bazaar, that famous column called The Ugly Girl Papers, which I have always thought was a remarkable choice of title, recommends an ointment of mercury oxide mixed with lard to be rubbed at the edges of eyelids to restore lost eyelashes. Mercury, applied to the eyelids, to encourage eyelash growth. The mercury, of course, was a neurotoxin, but the column offered it cheerfully with the same confident tone one might use to recommend a facial steam. And then there was arsenic. Arsenic was sold in the 1890s in the form of wafers, small edible tablets marketed with the names of approving doctors printed on the packaging. Sears and Roebuck offered a product called Dr. Campbell's Safe Arsenical Complexion Wafers. You were meant to eat them. The advertising promised they would clear freckles, blackheads, pimples, and what they charmingly described as vulgar redness. Safe. It was right there in the name. It was not safe. And here is the part of this story that moves me most. Victorian women were not by and large foolish. They were not oblivious to the concept of toxicity. Arsenic was well known as a poison regularly used in domestic settings, in ways that were considerably less benign, and Victorian courts saw numerous cases involving its deliberate misuse. But they lived in a world with no regulatory framework for cosmetics, no ingredient lists, no safety testing, no independent scientific journalism informing consumers of what was in their products. They had beauty columns that recommended things, magazines that advertised things, and the accumulated social pressure of living in a world that scrutinized their appearances constantly and rewarded pallor, smoothness, and youth. They made the choices that were available to them with the information they had, and they paid for those choices in ways that the men who set the beauty standards never did. There is one woman whose story I want to tell you because I think she captures this tension more sharply than any statistic. Maria Coventry, the Countess of Coventry, was an 18th century English socialite, one of the famous Gunning sisters considered among the great beauties of her age. She used white lead cosmetics extensively, as was common in her social circle. Her husband, the Earl of Coventry, disapproved to such a degree that he reportedly attempted to wipe the preparation from her face in public on at least one occasion. She died in 1760 at the age of 27. Lead poisoning was the suspected cause. Her husband's objection, we might note with some irony, was not grounded in concern for her health. It was grounded in the belief that wearing cosmetics was morally improper. The substance that was damaging her was considered a personal failing, not a danger, not a product safety failure, a moral failure. I sit with that for a long time when I think about it. The evening wound on. After the final course, after the dessert was cleared and the port was poured, the hostess would catch the eye of the principal lady at the table. A silent signal would pass between them. And then, as one etiquette guide describes it, an interchange of ocular telegraphing takes place. The hostess rose. All the ladies rose with her. They filed out of the dining room, leaving the gentlemen to their wine and cigars and unrestricted conversation. They went to the drawing room and waited. For the gentlemen to finish, for the evening to resume, for one more scene in the long performance of a Victorian Woman's Day, and what they did in that quiet drawing room while they waited, what they talked about, what they felt, what ran through their minds, is something history mostly did not record. But I have some idea, because the hours that came after dinner, the private hours, the night hours, the hours when the candles were finally extinguished, are where some of the most extraordinary, most quietly defiant moments in women's history took place. That is where we are heading next. The ladies retired to the drawing room. That was the phrase. That was how it ended every evening in the Victorian home where dinner had been served, and the gentlemen still lingered over their port and cigars. The ladies retired, and in that quiet space, that brief pause between the theatre of dinner and the resumption of general company, something happened that is genuinely hard to name. It was not quite freedom, but it was something adjacent to it. A temporary loosening, a room without men, however brief. What did they talk about, those women in the drawing room? History does not record most of it. That is partly the point. But we know what happened later. When the candles were finally extinguished, when the guests had gone home, and the house had settled into the particular quietness of a late Victorian night. That is when some of the most remarkable things happened. And almost all of them happened in private, in writing behind closed doors. Let me tell you about a woman named Anne Lister. Born in Halifax, England in 1791, landowner, businesswoman, traveller, and possibly the most prolific private diarist of the entire 19th century. During her lifetime, Anne Lister wrote 5 million words in her journal. 5 million. To put that in some perspective, that is roughly 3 times the length of the combined journals of Samuel Pepys, the 17th century diarist, who is often cited as the master of the form. She began writing at 15 years old. She kept writing until her death at 49. Her journals filled 26 hardbound volumes totaling 7,722 pages, and for approximately 1/6 of all those pages, 1/6 of that enormous outpouring of thought and experience in daily life, Anne Lister wrote in a secret code. She called it her crypt hand. It was a cipher she had developed as a teenager, combining Greek letters, zodiac symbols, punctuation marks, and mathematical notation, woven together without word breaks or spacing. To anyone who did not know the key, it looked like a page of symbols from some unknown ancient language. And for most of the 19th century, that was exactly what it remained. After her death in 1840, the diarist sat in Shibden Hall, her ancestral home, untouched for over 50 years. When her relative John Lister finally cracked the code in the 1890s, working through the night with a friend named Arthur Burrell, what they found was so shocking that Burrell immediately urged John to burn all 26 volumes. Burn them, all 5 million words. John, to his considerable credit, could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he did something that tells you a great deal about the particular anxiety of the Victorian era. He hid the diaries behind an oak panel in the wall at Shibden Hall, where they remained until his death in 1933. What was in those coded passages that so alarmed Arthur Burrell Ann Lister had been writing in meticulous detail about her relationships with women? Not friendships, relationships. Full complex, passionate love affairs with multiple women across the decades of her life, documented with a candour that left no room for ambiguity. The researcher Helena Whitbread, who finally published the Deciphered Diaries in 1988, described the coded writings as so explicit that they were initially believed by some scholars to be a hoax. They were not. In 2011, Ann Lister's diaries were inscribed in the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, Memory of the World Programme, the International Registry of Documentary Heritage of Global Significance. The citation noted specifically that while the diaries provided a valuable account of their time, it was the comprehensive and painfully honest account of lesbian life and reflections on her nature that made them unique in human history. An author named Emma Donoghue called them the Dead Sea Scrolls of lesbian history. I have always been moved by that image, because what it means is this Ann Lister spent the private hours of her nights doing something that the world around her had no language for, no category, for no tolerance for, and she wrote it all down, carefully, in code. Year after year after year, she wrote herself into existence, not for an audience, not for posterity as far as she knew, just for herself. In a diary entry from May of 1824, she writes, "What a comfort is this journal. I tell myself to myself and throw the burden on my book and feel relieved. I tell myself to myself." That sentence has stayed with me longer than almost anything I have read in the process of researching this story. The diary as private refuge was not unique to Ann Lister. The Victorian era was remarkably one of the great eras of diary keeping, and while men kept diaries too, the practice had a particular and complex significance for women. In a world where women's public speech was constrained, where what a woman said at a dinner party was carefully monitored, where her conversation was expected to be easy and playful and mirthful, and never controversial, the private diary was the one space where something like unfiltered thought could exist. Victorian diary culture was also intriguingly not always fully private. One historian has noted that the practice of reading the diaries of friends and relatives was widespread, and that diaries existed on a threshold between private and public. Parents read their children's diaries, spouses exchange journals. Princess Victoria herself, before she became queen, had her daily diary inspected by her mother every single day. And so even the diary required a kind of strategic navigation. Some women like Ann Lister developed codes. Others developed what we might call selective transparency writing, in ways that were technically legible, but emotionally impenetrable to anyone who did not already know them well. Others wrote in straightforward prose and simply accepted that their most private thoughts were not entirely safe even on the page. What I find remarkable is that they kept writing anyway, because the alternative, not writing, not having any space at all where unfiltered experience could be put into words, was something many women clearly found intolerable. Now here is a specific dimension of the after-dinner hours that I find genuinely extraordinary. The Victorian debate about women reading novels. I mentioned this only briefly earlier, but now I want to give it the space it deserves. Because the argument made against women reading novels was not that novels were boring, or that women's time would be better spent elsewhere. The argument was that novels were dangerous to women specifically. The reasoning as laid out in serious publications and educational guides throughout the era went something like this. Women were naturally more emotional, more susceptible to the pull of the imagination, more vulnerable to the seductive appeal of fiction. A novel that depicted life differently from how life was supposed to be, a woman who made bold choices, a marriage that challenged conventions, a heroine who felt the full range of human desire could, it was argued, corrupt the female mind. The appetite becomes too keen to be denied. One guide warned, and in proportion as it is, more urgent grows less nice and select in its fare. Hence the mind is secretly corrupted by reading a story. One Charlotte Elizabeth Brown, the daughter of a clergyman, claimed that reading Shakespeare at the age of 7 had permanently unnerved her judgment and perverted her estimates of people and things. Shakespeare. Now I want to be clear, these warnings about dangerous reading were overwhelmingly written by men about women. They were not for the most part the sincere personal convictions of the women who were supposedly being protected. And the more I read of this material, the more it reads less like genuine concern and more like a very thinly disguised anxiety about what women might think if left to think freely. Because here is what actually happened when Victorian women read novels. They read them constantly, secretly in some cases, in the late evening by inadequate candlelight well past the hour when the etiquette guides recommended they rest their eyes. They formed reading circles where they discussed novels together, and gradually under the polite cover of literary discussion, those circles became spaces for something that looked remarkably like intellectual community. They wrote letters to each other about what they had read, and those letters, thousands upon thousands of them tucked into archives across Britain and America, constitute one of the most remarkable bodies of female intellectual life in history. And some of them went further. Some of them wrote. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a mother of 7 children in mid-19th century America. Her life was by any objective measure relentlessly interrupted. In a letter she wrote to a friend, and I am paraphrasing here rather than quoting, directly she describes being called away from her writing again and again, throughout a single day, once for a delivery of fish, once for a man bringing apples, once for a book salesman, once for the children, once for her husband, once more for the fish. By the time she counted up the interruptions, it was evening, and what had taken the morning to write had taken the whole day. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel that Abraham Lincoln, when he met her during the American Civil War, is said to have credited with starting the conflict in the margins of her daily life. In the early mornings before the household woke, in the brief spaces between other people's needs, the book sold 300,000 copies in its first year of publication in 1852. In the decades that followed, it sold millions. It is generally considered one of the most socially consequential works of fiction in the history of the English language. Written by a woman in a kitchen between interruptions. What strikes me about all of this, about Anne Lister writing in code by candlelight about Victorian women hiding novels under needlework, about Harriet Beecher Stowe finding 20 minutes between the fishman and the apple seller, is how clearly it illustrates something about creativity and constraint. There is a persistent myth that freedom produces great work, that you need space and silence and permission and time, and sometimes that is true. But the historical record of women's private lives suggests something more complicated. That constraint pushed hard enough and long enough sometimes produces not silence, but a kind of fierce, concentrated urgency, a need to speak that becomes so insistent it finds its way through any available gap. A woman who could not speak openly in the drawing room after dinner went to her bedroom and wrote in code. A woman who could not publish under her own name published under a male pseudonym. A woman who was told that certain books would corrupt her, borrowed them from a circulating library and read them after midnight. And those act quiet, private, technically invisible, are woven into the fabric of everything we think of as Western literature and thought. There is something else I want to tell you about the night. Because the night held one more secret that most people today have never heard of, a secret that the Industrial Revolution actually took from us, though we have never really noticed it was gone. It has to do with how people slept, or more precisely the fact that for most of human history before the late 19th century they did not sleep the way we sleep now, I touched on this briefly at the very beginning of our journey tonight. Do you remember the medieval watch? That strange middle-of-the-night waking period that historian Roger Ekirch documented across over 500 sources from pre-industrial Europe for women. That quiet window held its own particular significance. But the full story of what the night actually meant for women across history, the rituals, the prayers, the unravelling of everything the day had required, is something we have not yet fully explored. We are about to go there now. Because when the diary was closed and the novel was set aside and the code was carefully locked back into the mind that held it, there was still the act of preparing for sleep itself. And that ritual for the women who lived it was the final and perhaps the most intimate performance of an entire day built on performance. The armour came off, and what happened in that quiet undressing, what was released and what was finally allowed to rest, is where we are heading next. Something changes when you take your hair down. I mean that literally. And I think anyone who has ever worn their hair up all day pinned, coiled, secured, and then felt it fall loose at the end of the evening, knows exactly what I am describing. There is a physical release that is also unmistakably an emotional one. For Victorian women, that moment had a significance that went far beyond anything we experience today. In Victorian society there was a rule unwritten, but as binding as anything in the etiquette guides, that a woman's hair once she reached a certain age could only be seen down in two places: in bed and in the presence of her lady's maid. That was it. Loose hair was so closely associated with intimacy with the private self rather than the public one that to be seen in public with hair unbound was in certain contexts a statement of moral character. Respectable women wore their hair up, always. The elaborate pinned styles you see in Victorian portraits, those towers of coils and braids and carefully engineered volume, those were not vanity projects, they were social armour. And every evening that armour came off. Let me walk you through the end of a Victorian day. It is somewhere between 10 o'clock and midnight. The guests have gone, the house is quieter, and a woman of means, let us say she lives comfortably in London, in one of those tall windowed houses near a park, has finally left the company and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Waiting for her is her lady's maid. This woman, the lady's maid, occupied a position in the Victorian household that is genuinely difficult to explain in modern terms. She was a servant, yes, and unambiguously below her mistress in every measurable social category. But she was also the person who every single day saw her mistress in the most physically vulnerable and unguarded states imaginable. She helped her dress and undress. She styled her hair. She prepared her skincare preparations, cleaned her jewellery, mended her most delicate garments. She travelled with her sometimes across countries. She knew what her mistress looked like without the corset, without the powder, without the carefully constructed social persona. She was in a very real sense the keeper of everything real. Mrs. Beeton, whom we met earlier in the morning, is quite specific about the qualities required. A lady's maid must be scrupulously clean and neat in her own person. She must possess discretion in the fullest possible degree. She must be loyal. She must never under any circumstances repeat what she has heard or seen in her mistress's chambers. And in practice, what this meant was that the lady's maid became for many Victorian women the most intimate relationship in their daily lives. More intimate in many households than the relationship with a husband. After all, the husband had his own dressing room, his own valet, his own private world. The couple shared a social life and a household and presumably affection. But the person who knew how your hair actually looked at the end of the evening, who knew which parts of the day had been genuinely exhausting and which had been bearable, who heard the slight loosening of formality that happened when the last button was undone, that was the maid. One historical account describes a lady's maid as a shadow companion. That phrase has always felt both beautiful and melancholy to me. A whole human life spent in the shadow of another woman's, trusted with her secrets, absent from her history. The undressing itself was a ceremony in reverse. Everything that had been assembled in the morning was now carefully disassembled. The pins came out of the hair, and there could be dozens of them for an elaborate Victorian coiffure was essentially an engineering project. The evening gown with its rows of small buttons was unfastened. The corset was unlaced, the petticoats removed, the jewellery returned to its case, and as each layer came away, something changed in the room. The formality of the day receded, and in that receding Victorian women sometimes said things to their maids, or simply to themselves, that they could not have said anywhere else. One thing I find remarkable about the ladies-maid relationship is precisely the asymmetry of what was exchanged. The mistress could confide in the maid. The maid could not confide in the mistress, not equally, not without risking her position. The relationship operated on an enforced silence that worked entirely in one direction, and yet women became devoted to their maids. Some kept the same maid for decades through marriages and children and illness, and the slow accumulation of a life. Some left them significant legacies. Some wrote about them with a warmth that is genuinely touching given the constraints that governed the relationship on both sides. The Victorian novelist and poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, yes of the famous correspondence with Robert Browning, had a maid named Elizabeth Wilson, who served her for years and eventually accompanied the couple when they fled England for Italy in their secret elopement. Wilson navigated Florence when she spoke. No Italian managed a foreign household helped care for the Browning's son. She spent her life in the most intimate proximity to one of the greatest love stories of the 19th century, and almost no one has heard her name. Now back to the hair. Because the evening hair ritual deserves its own moment because it is one of those daily acts that sounds simple and is actually full of meaning. Victorian beauty guides are remarkably specific about this. One guide from 1910 called Health and Beauty Hints instructs that an expert lady's maid is taught first of all to give her mistress 100 strokes with the brush at night as she is retiring. 100 strokes. The number 100 comes up again and again in Victorian hair literature, and the reasoning was practical. Victorian women washed their hair rarely, sometimes only monthly because soap was harsh, and hot water was difficult to obtain in large quantities, and very long hair was genuinely difficult to dry. The twice-daily brushing was how the hair was cleaned between washes, distributing the natural oils from roots to ends, removing dust and keeping the scalp stimulated, but 100 strokes night after night performed by the maid while her mistress sat before the mirror, that is not a casual activity. That is a ritual. In many households, the hair brushing was the quietest, most unguarded moment of the entire day. The body is still. The room is warm and private. The social mask is entirely off, and there is a rhythm to it, that repetitive gentle stroke from scalp to end that is almost meditative, almost hypnotic. I keep wondering what was said in those rooms during those 100 strokes, what was confessed or merely exhaled, what was finally allowed to be felt. Let me ask you something personal. When is the last time you had a day that required that much performance? A day where every gesture, every word, every expression was being monitored and interpreted, where you changed your clothes 3 times to signal 3 different versions of yourself, where the way you poured tea or where you sat at a table conveyed your social rank to everyone in the room. I am not being rhetorical. I genuinely think about this, because the Victorian evening, with its ritual undressing, its 100 brush strokes, its quiet confession of exhaustion to a woman who could not repeat it, feels to me like a necessary pressure valve for a kind of social pressure that never really let up. It was the release that allowed the whole structure to continue functioning. There was a second ritual of the Victorian night that I find equally compelling: prayer, before bed prayer. not as a perfunctory habit, but as something taken seriously with genuine belief and genuine need. One of the things that distinguished Victorian religious practice from what came before was its intensely personal character. This was the era of what historians call evangelical Christianity, where the relationship with God was understood as personal and direct and deeply emotional, not just institutional. And for women who were excluded from the public practice of religion in many of its formal expressions, private prayer was one of the few spaces of genuine spiritual authority they possessed. A woman could pray for things she could not say aloud anywhere else. For a child who was sick, for a marriage that was difficult, for the quiet, shameful grief of a miscarriage she was expected to recover from quickly and not speak of, for the patience required to continue being what the world demanded she be. Victorian bedtime prayers were often lengthy, specific and intensely felt. Queen Victoria herself left records of her night prayers that are striking in their emotional directness. She prayed for the dead by name for years after their deaths, in a longing and undiminished grief that the formal protocols of public mourning had long since required her to set aside. The night was the only place that grief could simply exist without needing to be managed, and then finally sleep. But not for much of the era we've been exploring the sleep we experience now. Remember, before the Industrial Revolution and the spread of artificial lighting into working-class and middle-class homes, the natural rhythm of the night was segmented. People slept in two phases: a first sleep that began shortly after dark, a waking period the watch of 1 to 3 hours, then a second sleep that carried them through to morning. And during that waking interval, that quiet window in the middle of the night, women like our Agnes from the very beginning of this story were not lying awake with anxiety the way we might. They were simply awake, naturally peacefully, as their bodies intended. They might stir the fire, they might feed a baby, they might say a quiet prayer, they might lie in the darkness next to a sleeping husband and simply think in a way that the crowded, monitored hours of the day never permitted. Historian Roger Kirch, who spent over 20 years documenting this two-phase sleep pattern across more than 500 historical sources, notes that this pre-dawn waking was sometimes described as a particularly lucid state, a kind of gentle consciousness that was neither fully awake nor fully asleep, a space for reflection that had no equivalent in the daytime. The Industrial Revolution took that away. Factory schedules demanded consolidated, uninterrupted sleep. Gaslighting and later electric light pushed bedtimes later, and later compressing the sleeping hours into one continuous block. By the early 20th century, the idea of waking in the middle of the night was no longer considered natural. It had become a symptom, something to be treated, a sign of insomnia, rather than simply the body following its ancient rhythm. We lost something when we lost that watch, a quiet hour in the dark belonging to no one and requiring nothing, just being. I want to sit with that for a moment before we move on, because across everything we have covered today, from Agnes lighting her fire before dawn to the Victorian lady of fashion with her 100 brush strokes and her prayer, there has been a thread running through it all that I keep returning to. These women were never fully at rest. From the moment the first light reached their windows to the last prayer before sleep, they were producing, managing, performing, enduring, sustaining. Their lives were built on a scaffolding of routine so dense and so total that the only true privacy available to most of them was the small dark hours that no one else could see. And in those hours in the diaries written in secret code, in the prayers said for grief that had no public outlet, in the fragmented early morning wakefulness of a world before electric light, they were finally simply themselves, not wives, not mistresses of households, not callers of cards or pourers of tea or performers at dinner tables, just women, breathing in the dark. And in the next part of this story, we're going to meet some of the women who refused to wait for the dark, who took those private invisible acts, the writing, the thinking, the refusing, and carried them into the daylight, who broke the routine, not with a dramatic gesture, but from inside it quietly, persistently, in the most ordinary of places. Their story is one of the most remarkable in all of women's history, and it begins right now. Most rebellions in history announce themselves. There is a battle, a proclamation, a moment when someone stands up in a public place and says no more. But the rebellion I want to talk about in this part of our story announced itself very quietly. It looked like a woman at a writing desk. It looked like a woman walking a hospital corridor alone at midnight carrying a lamp. It looked like a woman arguing with a publisher that her name, her full, actual name, should appear on the title page. And these small, almost invisible acts change the world more completely than many of the louder revolutions happening around them. Let me take you back for a moment to the year 1792. The French Revolution is at its height. The entire Western world is in the grip of a debate about rights, about liberty, about who deserves to be counted as a full human being with a claim to dignity and self-determination. In London, a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft is watching this debate with a very specific kind of fury, because the revolutionaries across the Channel, the men writing ringing declarations about liberty and equality, were to a remarkable degree talking only about themselves. In 1791, the French statesman Charles de Talleyrand presented a report to the French National Assembly recommending an education system for the new republic. For boys, full education in reason, science, philosophy, the arts of citizenship. For girls, domestic education. That was it. Prepare them for the home. Nothing else is necessary. Mary Wollstonecraft read this and felt by her own account sorrowful indignation. And she wrote. She wrote fast accounts suggest she worked in a state of high urgency, racing to keep pace with the revolution itself, pouring argument onto the page with what her publisher described as an intensity he had rarely seen. The book she produced was called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792. In it, she made an argument so simple and so devastating that it still feels sharp 230 years later. Women are not naturally inferior, she wrote. They only appear to be because they have been deliberately kept from education. Give women the same rational training as men, and they will demonstrate the same capacities. The weakness that society has decided is female nature is not nature at all. It is the product of a system, and the system is a choice. Now I want to pause on Mary Wollstonecraft for a moment because I think her life and her daily reality illustrate something important about what it actually meant to break the routine. She had worked as a governess, as a companion, as a schoolteacher. She had taken on every occupation available to educated women of her era, and every single one of those occupations had placed her in a position of social subordination, doing intellectual and emotional work that was undervalued and underpaid in the service of families that considered her barely above a servant. And out of that specific embodied experience, not from a position of comfort or safety, but from the grinding daily reality of being a woman whose intelligence exceeded what her world could accommodate, she wrote one of the most consequential political arguments in the history of Western thought. She didn't have a study. She didn't have an appointment. She had a desk, a publisher named Joseph Johnson, who believed in her, and an incandescent clarity about what she had seen. She was 33 years old. She died 5 years later at 38 from complications following childbirth. Her daughter, by a philosopher named William Godwin, would grow up to write a novel called Frankenstein. The Wollstonecraft women had a way of creating things that outlasted them. Let me jump forward about 60 years, to a hospital in a place called Scutari in what is now Istanbul in Turkey. November of 1854, a woman named Florence Nightingale has just arrived with 38 volunteer nurses to help manage the British military hospital during the Crimean War. What she found when she arrived was almost indescribable: wounded and dying soldiers on filthy mattresses or on the bare floor. No basic sanitation, no accurate record keeping. Multiple separate military registries using incompatible accounting systems, making it impossible to know how many men had died or from what causes. She found that in January of 1855, almost 12,000 of the 25,000 British soldiers deployed in the war zone were on the sick lists. Only around 150 of them had been wounded in battle. The rest were dying of disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, things that even by the standards of 1854 medicine were preventable with basic sanitation. Florence Nightingale absorbed all of this, and she did two things simultaneously. She organised the immediate care of patients, improving sanitation, controlling infection, feeding the men, making the wards functional, and she counted. Every night. And I mean this literally. This is where the famous lamp comes in. After the medical officers had retired and the wards had quieted, Florence Nightingale walked 4 miles of corridors alone with a small lantern in her hand, stopping to check on patients, to speak with the soldiers and to collect data, to count the dead, to record causes, to create the detailed statistical record that no one around her considered necessary or appropriate for a woman to be doing. She walked 4 miles of hospital wards in the dark every night. That became the image the world fell in love with. The lady with the lamp. The gentle, feminine figure bringing comfort to suffering soldiers. What that image mostly missed was the other thing she was doing with that lamp. She was shining it on data. Florence Nightingale is often celebrated as the founder of modern nursing, and she was. But I want to tell you about a dimension of her work that is less widely known because I think it is actually more radical. She was also one of the most important statisticians and data visualizers of the 19th century. When she returned to London in 1856, she knew she had to convince the British government, the army, the parliament, the Queen herself, that the sanitary conditions in military hospitals needed fundamental reform. The problem was that the people she needed to convince were not statisticians. They were politicians and generals, people who understood influence and anecdote but not numbers. People who, when presented with a column of figures, felt their eyes glaze and their attention drift. So Florence Nightingale did something that was for its time genuinely revolutionary. She invented a new kind of chart. Today we call it a polar area diagram, or sometimes a coxcomb chart. It was circular, divided into segments representing months of the year, with different coloured sections showing deaths from preventable disease, deaths from battle wounds, and deaths from other causes. The visual impact was immediate and undeniable. Blue section after blue section after blue section. Deaths from preventable disease, dwarfing the red segments of battle wounds. You didn't need to understand statistics to understand that chart. You could look at it for 10 seconds and know with absolute certainty that more soldiers were dying from filth than from bullets. A Scientific American article about her work notes that after returning from the Crimea, she worked 20-hour days, mostly behind the scenes, writing letters, wrangling data, and publishing anonymously. She knew that the window of public attention was closing and she had to move fast. 20-hour days. This is the woman Victorian society expected to be doing needlework and making morning calls. Can I ask you something? When you picture Florence Nightingale, what do you see? I think most people see the lamp, the nighttime rounds, the soft, compassionate figure in a dark ward. And she was all of those things. But she was also a woman who sat at a desk in London for years after the Crimea building statistical arguments so airtight that they changed British public health law. The British Public Health Act of 1875, which established requirements for sewers, clean running water, and regulated building codes, and which historians credit with being one of the key drivers of the doubling of average human life expectancy over the following century. That legislation was built in significant part on the data that Florence Nightingale collected and visualized. She was the first woman elected a Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. She received the Order of Merit in 1907, the first woman ever to do so. She lived to be 90 years old, spending the last decades of her life largely in her home, working, writing, corresponding, analyzing, rarely leaving, rarely receiving visitors, but she never stopped counting. Here is what strikes me most about both of these women, Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792 and Florence Nightingale in the 1850s and 60s. They were not working in opposition to the daily routines we've been exploring throughout this story. They were working inside them. Mary Wollstonecraft was in many ways living the life the system assigned to women working as a governess, financially dependent, socially subordinate. And from within that life, from the precise vantage point of someone who had felt its constraints from the inside, she wrote the argument that would eventually dismantle them. Florence Nightingale, born into a wealthy family, had spent years fighting to be allowed to do nursing work at all her parents initially refused, because nursing was considered far beneath a woman of her class. She performed the domestic rituals expected of her. She attended the dinners, made the calls, did what was required, and she sustained a burning, disciplined private life of reading, studying mathematics, visiting hospitals, that eventually erupted into something the world could not ignore. Both of them used the tools of the routine to break it. Let me tell you about one more woman because I think she completes this particular picture. Her name was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. In 1860, she decided she wanted to become a doctor, not a nurse, a physician. At the time, there was not a single medical school in the United Kingdom that would admit women, not one. So Elizabeth Garrett Anderson did something that in hindsight is both brilliant and somewhat exhausting to contemplate. She found every available loophole in the existing system and walked through it. She could not attend lectures officially, so she arranged to observe operations informally as a visitor. She could not sit the formal examinations, so she found a smaller examining body that had not specifically excluded women from its rules. She passed their examination in 1865, becoming the first woman in Britain to gain a medical qualification. The examining body promptly changed its rules to exclude women from future examinations, so Elizabeth Garrett Anderson essentially forced the creation of the London School of Medicine for Women established in 1874, which provided what the existing institutions had refused to offer. She became the first female mayor in England. She lived to 81. And here is the detail I cannot stop thinking about. Throughout this entire period, while she was negotiating access to medical lectures, sitting, examinations that were designed to exclude her, and eventually founding a medical school, she continued to navigate Victorian social life with the full apparatus of propriety intact. Morning calls, afternoon visiting, evening dinner parties. She did not withdraw from society to pursue her ambitions. She was present in both worlds simultaneously, which when you think about it is more demanding than anything we have talked about today. I keep returning to a question that runs underneath all of this. What does it take to hold two versions of yourself in parallel? The version that is present at the dinner table, correct and agreeable and appropriately dressed, performing the daily ritual of being a woman in your particular world, and the other version, the one that goes home afterward and works at a desk until midnight, or collects data in a dark hospital corridor, or writes an argument so clear it still resonates 2 centuries later. How do you sustain both? And the answer, I think based on everything these women left behind in their letters and diaries and lives, is that you do not sustain them equally. One feeds the other. The discipline of the routine, the enforced patience of it, the practice of performing competence under conditions of constraint, That discipline became the very thing that made their other work possible. They learned to work in fragments, in stolen hours, under conditions of interruption and observation that would have stopped many people entirely. And that is not an accident. The routine did not just contain these women. In some cases, it forged them. We have now travelled almost the entire arc of a single day, from before sunrise when women in every era have been rising to the demands of the world, through the morning rituals and the afternoon social machinery, through the dinner table and the drawing room and the quiet undressing at night, to the dark hours when the most private work happened, and now to this, the women who carried that private work into the daylight and changed things. But there is one more dimension of this story that I've been saving, because everything we have discussed today, every ritual, every constraint, every small act of rebellion left something behind, something you might carry with you without knowing it into your own daily life. The things these women did, the habits they kept, the routines that shaped and sometimes freed them, those things did not simply disappear. They became us. And in the final parts of this story, we're going to look at what that inheritance actually means, what the daily lives of women across history left in the fabric of our own, and why even now, even tonight as you listen to this, the echo of those routines is still shaping something you have not yet noticed. Let's go there now. There is a question I've been sitting with for the last several weeks of researching this story. And it goes something like this: if you stripped away everything that changed the electricity, the antibiotics, the legal rights, the career choices, the freedom of movement, and you looked only at the internal architecture of a woman's day, how much of what we do right now was first built by the women we have been talking about for the last 10 hours? More than I expected, honestly. More, I think, than most people realize. And part 10 of our story is about that. It is about what did not end when the Victorian era ended, what did not disappear when the corsets were finally permanently put away, what travelled forward quietly in the daily habits and the instincts and the social reflexes of every woman who came after. Let me start with something that happened in 1903. A woman named Emmeline Pankhurst, widow, mother of 5, resident of Manchester, founded an organisation called the Women's Social and Political Union. Its motto was 4 words, deeds, not words. This was not an abstract philosophical statement. It was a direct rejection of the previous 50 years of polite petition and parliamentary lobbying that had asked very nicely for women's right to vote and had been ignored very consistently by the men who held the power to grant it. Deeds, not words. What that meant in practice was a campaign so disruptive that the British government did not know how to contain it. The suffragettes, a name originally coined as an insult by a Daily Mail journalist in 1906, and which the women immediately adopted with pride, marched, shouted, smashed windows, and chained themselves to railings. They heckled cabinet ministers and interrupted political meetings. They set fire to empty buildings and dropped lit matches into letterboxes, and when they were arrested, which happened repeatedly to hundreds of women, they went to prison, and in prison they went on hunger strike. The first hunger strike by a suffragette was launched in 1909 by a woman named Marion Wallace Dunlop, who'd been sentenced to a month in Holloway Prison for stenciling a message on a wall in the House of Commons. She decided entirely on her own initiative, without consulting any leadership, that she would refuse food until she was treated as a political prisoner rather than a common criminal. The authorities responded with force-feeding. I want you to sit with what that means for a moment, because I think it is easy to read those words and move past them. Force-feeding meant prison guards and medical staff physically holding a woman down, while forcing a rubber tube through her nose or into her mouth and pouring liquid food directly into her stomach. Struggling women suffered broken teeth, internal bleeding, vomiting, choking. In some cases, the tube was inserted incorrectly and went into the lungs. Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the movement, described the sounds from Holloway Prison during those periods as sickening scenes of violence taking place almost every hour of the day as the doctors went from cell to cell. These were not fringe figures, not people on the margins of society. They were teachers, nurses, mothers, writers, women who had spent decades being told that patient-polite, procedurally correct lobbying was the appropriate way to pursue their cause. And they decided that patience had run out. Now here is the thing I want to emphasize because it connects directly to everything we have explored about women's daily routines throughout this story. The suffragette movement did not emerge from nowhere. It was built methodically and deliberately from the very infrastructure that Victorian women had spent a century constructing. The letter-writing networks that kept Victorian women connected across thousands of miles. The suffragettes used them to organise, coordinate and communicate faster than the authorities could track. The calling card system, that intricate social machinery for managing who had access to whom. The suffragettes used their social networks with equal precision. Who could be converted? Who was already sympathetic? Whose husband was a member of Parliament? Whose drawing room could host a meeting? The money management skills that Victorian housewives had quietly developed running household accounts and tracking every penny of domestic expenditure. Those skills translated directly into the financial organisation of a serious political campaign. The afternoon tea ritual, that female-controlled social space where women had exercised soft power for decades. The WSPU held tea meetings that were also recruitment meetings, fundraising events disguised as gatherings, strategy sessions held in the drawing room under the cover of social convention. Even the physical discipline that Victorian women had developed simply to endure their daily lives, the capacity to maintain composure under observation, to tolerate discomfort, to manage pain, without showing it, to keep functioning through constraint, that discipline was what allowed women on hunger strike to endure force feeding and walk back into the struggle when they were released. The routine did not just constrain these women. In the end, it armed them. And then, almost exactly as the suffragettes were making their final push, something happened that no one had planned for. The First World War. In August of 1914, Emmeline Pankhurst suspended all suffragette activities for the duration of the war. This was deeply controversial within the movement, and it fractured the organisation. Some women, including Emmeline's own daughters Sylvia and Adela, refused to stop agitating. But the mainstream of the WSPU, the women who had thrown themselves at Parliament with such ferocity for over a decade, turned that same energy toward the war effort. And here is what happened. With millions of men away at the front, the British economy needed workers. Women stepped into every role that had previously been categorised as exclusively male. They drove buses and ambulances. They worked in munitions factories. They became clerks, postal workers, police officers, administrative staff. They managed farms and ran businesses, and the world watched. Not with the anxiety that had previously greeted women in public roles, but with something approaching genuine shock at how well they performed. The women's suffrage historian Millicent Fawcett, who had led the moderate constitutional wing of the movement for decades, said afterward that women had worked not merely to win the war, but to demonstrate their right to full citizenship, and that they had demonstrated it irrefutably. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act gave British women over 30, who met certain property requirements, the right to vote. Full suffrage, equal voting rights for all adult women came 10 years later in 1928. Emmeline Pankhurst died 3 weeks after that bill became law. She had spent 50 years fighting for it. She did not quite live to see her final victory. Let me stop there for a moment and ask you something. When did you last feel impatient about something that was taking too long? When did you last have the thought, this is supposed to have changed already? Why hasn't it changed yet? I think about Emmeline Pankhurst and the 50 years. I think about Mary Wollstonecraft writing in 1792 and not living to see even the first women gain the vote over a century later. I think about Florence Nightingale, who spent 45 years of her life working quietly from her house, rarely leaving, rarely receiving visitors, sending letter after letter after letter into a system that moved slowly. There is something in that kind of persistence that I find almost incomprehensible and also deeply instructive, not because we should all accept slow change without resistance, but because those women understood something about the long game that the culture of impatience around us tends to obscure. That some things take generations, that you may plant something you will never see flower, that the work you do in the daily hours of your ordinary life, however constrained, however unrecognized, accumulates. Now I want to bring this much closer to the present, because I promised you at the end of our last part that we would look at what the daily lives of historical women left behind in the fabric of our own. So let me ask you this: what do you do every morning? Not rhetorically. Actually think about it for a second. Do you have a skincare routine, a morning coffee ritual, a walk, or a few minutes of quiet before the day starts? Do you keep some kind of journal, even irregularly? Do you have a group chat, a circle of women you check in with, share information with support and are supported by? If any of those are true, you are doing something that has a very long history. The skincare ritual, that careful meditative attention to the face and body, runs in a direct line from the Victorian cold cream recipes and rosewater preparations we explored earlier, through to the Edwardian beauty advice columns, through the 20th century's growing cosmetics industry, and into the elaborate multi-step routines that fill entire sections of modern social media. The morning coffee or tea, the deliberate pause before the day, carries the echo of the Victorian afternoon tea ritual in its bones. That idea that a particular hot drink taken in a particular way at a particular time is a form of self-care and social connection, not merely a caffeine delivery mechanism. The journal or even the late-night notes on your phone that you sometimes scroll back through is a descendant of those Victorian private diaries. The impulse to document your own experience, to put the interior life into words, to have a place where the unfiltered version of yourself can exist. And the group chat, the close circle of women who share information about jobs and relationships and health and local logistics and who is behaving badly and who needs support. That's the calling card system adapted for digital life. That is the afternoon tea table stretched across time zones and phone screens. That is 5,000 years of women building the kind of network that formal institutions denied them, because formal institutions denied it and finding ways to make it work regardless. There is something else I want to say here because I think it is important, and I think it gets lost when we talk about history. The women in this story were not simply enduring. I want to push back against a version of this history that presents it only as oppression survived. Because that is true, but it is not the whole truth. Alongside everything that was difficult and unjust, there was also in the evidence these women left behind genuine pleasure in the ritual of the table set beautifully, in the smell of good bread made well, in the social electricity of a drawing room where the conversation is sharp and the company is excellent, in the particular satisfaction of a household running smoothly, which is a form of competence and mastery even when it is unrecognized, in the intimacy of a friendship conducted across hundreds of letters, which is by any measure an extraordinary relationship, in the quiet hour at the end of the day when the hair comes down and the day's armour is finally removed, in the novel read under inadequate candlelight that transported a woman somewhere entirely her own for a few private hours. These are not small things, they are not nothing, and I think we make a mistake if we look at the lives of historical women only through the lens of what was taken from them, rather than also attending to what they made inside the constraints, because what they made was real, and it is still here. the Representation of the People Act passed in 1918, women gained full suffrage in the United Kingdom in 1928. American women had won the vote in 1920. And as those legal walls began to come down slowly unevenly, with many remaining walls still standing in other countries and in other domains of life, something interesting happened to the daily routines we've been exploring. They did not disappear. They transformed. The elaborate Victorian morning dressing ritual became the modern beauty routine. The calling card system became the social network. The household account ledger became the budget app. The afternoon tea became the coffee meeting, the working lunch, the Saturday brunch. The diary became the journal, became the blog, became the personal essay, became the podcast. The sewing circle became the book club, became the women's professional network, became the group chat. Every single one of these modern forms carries the functional DNA of something older. And I find that genuinely moving, not because the past was better, it wasn't, but because it means that all of that labour, all of those women who got up before dawn to light fires, who managed invisible economies, who built social networks out of calling cards and afternoon visits, who wrote in code and read dangerous novels and argued in letters for rights they would never live to exercise, all of that was not wasted. It became infrastructure. The infrastructure that the women who came after them inherited and built upon and are still building. We're almost at the end of this story. Almost. But there are two more things I want to tell you before we close, because I think they complete the picture in ways that nothing else quite can. The first is about what happened to our medieval friend Agnes, or rather to the class of women she represents when the Industrial Revolution finally arrived and changed everything about how the day was structured. And the second is something much more personal, something about what this whole story means, not just historically, but for you listening to this right now tonight. That is where we are going next. Something happened to the daily lives of working women that almost no one talks about, and it happened fast. Not over centuries the way the changes we have discussed in earlier parts of this story unfolded. This one moved like a flood. The Industrial Revolution, and specifically the moment when the Industrial Revolution collided with the ancient rhythm of women waking up with the sun. Let me set the scene. It is the early decades of the 19th century. Britain is being remade. Cities are swelling at a rate that has no precedent in human history. Manchester grows from around 25,000 people in 1772 to over 300,000 by 1850. London becomes the largest city on earth, and filling those cities, flooding into the factories and mills and textile works and dye houses and printing shops that are springing up everywhere, are people who came from the countryside. Among them in enormous numbers are women. Now I want to draw a very specific contrast here because I think it illuminates something important. We spent considerable time earlier in our story looking at the Victorian lady of the upper and middle classes, her elaborate morning dressing ritual, her household accounts, her afternoon calls, her drawing room carefully managed for social effect. That life, that whole architecture of feminine routine was made possible by one thing above all others: other women's labour. The scullery maid who'd already lit the kitchen fire by 6 in the morning, the general servant who had swept the front steps and cleaned the boots before the family had their breakfast. The mill girl who had risen at 5 o'clock or earlier walked through the dark to a factory and spent 12 to 16 hours at a machine so that the fine fabrics in those elaborate Victorian wardrobes could be woven and produced at a cost the middle class could afford. 2 worlds, 1 city, separated by a social distance so complete that the people living 3 streets apart might as well have been living in different centuries. And the women at the bottom of that divide had a relationship with the beginning of the day that was unlike anything we have talked about so far. Let me introduce you to a woman named Mary Smith. Mary Smith lived in East London in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Not because she wanted to, not because a domestic routine required it, not because Mrs. Beeton had recommended early rising as a virtue, because that was her job. Mary Smith was a knocker-upper. And if you have never heard that term, I want you to picture this. The Industrial Revolution had created a problem that seems almost absurd in retrospect, but was at the time completely real. Factory workers had to arrive at a specific time under a system that imposed fines for lateness. Their entire family's financial survival could depend on not missing a shift. But affordable, reliable alarm clocks did not yet exist. The first adjustable mechanical alarm clock dates to 1847. Mass production made them common only gradually, and even then. For decades, industrial workers earning between 10 and 20 shillings a week could not easily afford them, so someone had to wake the workers. Mary Smith was that someone. She walked the streets of East London from 3 in the morning carrying a long rubber tube, essentially a pea shooter, which she used to shoot dried peas at her clients' bedroom windows, floor after floor, house after house, up and down the dark and quiet streets. She charged 6pence a week. She would not leave a window until she had seen a response, until a hand appeared or a curtain moved confirming that her client was awake. She did this every single morning in all weather for years. There were many women who worked as knocker-uppers across industrial Britain. Mrs. Waters of Leeds built a roster of at least 80 clients over 30 years of service, waking as early as 2:30 in the morning on some days in all weather, charging most clients 3p a week. That income from this remarkable night work paid for her son's education and supported her invalid husband. Think about that for a moment. The money that funded a child's future, that gave a family in industrial Britain some foothold toward a different kind of life, came from a woman walking dark streets at 3 in the morning with a long stick or a pea shooter, tapping on windows so other people could get to work. She did not appear in history books. She did not leave letters or diaries. She exists, if she exists at all, as a name in a census record or a brief mention in a newspaper article that someone happened to preserve. And yet the Industrial Revolution could not have run without her. The knocker-upper profession is to me one of the most extraordinary and unrecognized chapters in the history of women's daily work, because it illustrates in the most visceral possible way the shift that the Industrial Revolution made to the rhythm of women's lives. Before factories, before the relentless tyranny of the factory clock, human beings, and women especially, had organized their days around natural rhythms, the sun, the seasons, the needs of animals, the demands of the body. Yes, those rhythms imposed their own constraints. Agnes, waking at dawn to light the fire, had no choice in the matter. But the structure of her day had a certain organic quality. It bent and flexed with the weather, with the harvest, with illness, with the natural pace of tasks. The factory changed all of that. Now there was a bell, a whistle, a fixed starting time fixed in advance, enforced by a foreman who deducted wages for tardiness. The body's own rhythms became irrelevant. What mattered was the clock. And so women like Mary Smith emerged, human alarm clocks threading through the pre-dawn darkness as the strange necessary bridge between the natural world and the industrial one, the last fragment of one era before the machine fully took over. There is something almost poetic about that. The knocker-upper standing at 3 in the morning under a gaslit street shooting dried peas at a second-floor window is the last descendant of Agnes tending her fire, one woman's labour making it possible for other people to face the demands of the day. Except now the demands came from a factory whistle instead of a sunrise. The factory brought other changes to women's daily lives that deserve at least a moment of attention, because they were genuinely seismic. Women who went to work in the mills and factories of industrial Britain were for the first time in most of their lives earning a wage, Not all women, not the working class as a whole. This is a more complicated picture than any single narrative can capture. Many married women continued to manage households and take in piecework at home. Many women continued as domestic servants, but a significant portion of the female labour force was now for the first time in a formal wage relationship. And what that meant, however modest those wages were, however exploitative the conditions, was a new kind of economic existence. 67% of factory workers in the British textile industries in the 1830s were female. Over half the entire factory workforce was women and girls, in cotton, in flax, in silk. Manufacture women were the majority. The conditions they worked in were often genuinely terrible. 12-hour days were standard. 16-hour days were not unusual. The factories were loud. The noise of the looms was so extreme that workers developed their own systems of lip reading and hand signals to communicate over the roar. The air was full of cotton dust which caused lung disease. The machinery was unguarded and regularly caused severe injuries, and yet there is something in the first-person accounts of some of these women, particularly the Lowell Mill girls in Massachusetts, those New England farm daughters who flooded into the textile mills in the 1830s and 40s, that is not purely grim. That contains alongside the hardship a genuine exhilaration, because for many of these young women the factory represented the first time they had earned money that was technically their own, the first time they had lived away from their family's farm or their employer's house, the first time they had been in a community of other women of their own age with their own thoughts and concerns and ambitions. The Lowell women had their own literary magazine. They published poetry fiction and essays in a publication called The Lowell Offering, entirely written and edited by mill workers. They organised. When the mills tried to raise boarding house rents in 1836, the Lowell women went on strike. They struck. These were farm daughters, many of them teenagers who had arrived in industrial Massachusetts with almost nothing, and within a few years they were organising collective labour actions. The factory disciplined them. It also inadvertently organised them. Can I share something that strikes me about all of this? We tend to talk about women's history in two registers. One is the upper register, the educated women, the reformers, the writers, the women whose names we know. Florence Nightingale and Mary Wollstonecraft and Emmeline Pankhurst and all the women we have talked about throughout this story. And the other register, the one that is harder to find in the historical record, is the enormous quiet majority. The Agnes who lit the fire, the Mary Smith who shot peas at windows at 3 a.m, the factory girl whose name nobody kept, the maid of all work who rose at 6 before the family stirred. History has a very strong tendency to record the first register and lose the second. But here is what I keep coming back to. The ordinary daily life of ordinary women, the repetitive, unglamorous, undocumented labour of getting up every morning and making the day, function that is not the background to history. That is the foundation of it. Without the Agnes who kept the fire, the family does not eat. Without the Mary Smith who knocked on windows at 3 a.m, the factory does not open on time. Without the mill girl who stood at her loom for 12 hours, the fabric does not exist. Without the domestic servant who lit the morning fire in 100,000 middle-class houses across Victorian Britain, the entire social structure that produced the lawyers and the politicians and the reformers and the novelists collapses. The invisible labour is what everything else stands on. By the early 20th century, the knocker-upper profession was beginning to fade. Alarm clocks were becoming affordable. Electric buzzers attached to factory whistles could wake a whole neighbourhood at once. The phone, that extraordinary new technology, allowed employers to call workers directly. The long pole and the pea shooter and the woman walking dark streets at 3 a.m. were becoming obsolete. The last knocker-uppers in Britain's mill towns worked into the 1940s, and in some small communities even the early 1970s. One of them, a woman from Lancashire named Granny Cousins, had been doing it since 1901. 70 years of pre-dawn rounds. When she retired, there was no ceremony, no public acknowledgement, no monument was built. She simply stopped knocking on windows, and the streets in the morning were a little quieter. Here is the thing that I want to leave you with from this part of our story. Throughout everything we've explored, from Agnes and her medieval fire to the Vestal Virgins with their sacred flame, from the Victorian lady assembling herself layer by layer, to the knocker upper walking East London at 3 a.m, one thread has run through all of it. Women were always at the beginning of the day, not in the glamorous historical record sense, not in the sense that gets you into the textbooks, in the irreducible practical sense. The day did not start until someone made it start, and for most of recorded history in most places that someone was a woman. We're nearly at the end of this journey, one more part remains, and in it I want to do something a little different from everything that has come before. I want to stop telling you about other women's daily lives, and I want to talk directly to you about yours, because I think there is something in everything we have covered tonight, something that connects directly to the life you are living right now, in whatever time and place you are hearing this, that I have been building towards since the very first words of this story. And it begins with a question so simple it almost sounds too small. But I promise you it is not small at all. Stay with me just a little longer. The question I promised you, it is this. What does your morning look like? Not ideally, not aspirationally, not the morning you plan in your head the night before. The real one. The one where the alarm goes off and you already have 3 things you need to remember before your feet hit the floor. The one where you check your phone before you're fully conscious, because something is waiting. Someone needs something. Some task has carried over from yesterday. Some obligation has attached itself to the first minutes of a new day before you have even decided how you feel about being awake. I'm asking because I think that morning, that very ordinary, very modern, slightly overwhelming morning, has more in common with the mornings we have explored tonight than almost anything else in contemporary life. Here is what the numbers say. Right now today, women around the world spend an average of 2.8 more hours per day on unpaid care and domestic work than men do. Per day. That is not a number from the 19th century. That is not a historical artifact. According to research by the United Nations, women globally spend at least 3 times as much time on unpaid work as men. In some countries, that figure reaches 11 times as much. The estimated economic value of this unpaid labour, the cooking, the childcare, the elderly care, the managing of household logistics, the mental load of tracking everyone else's needs before your own runs, to somewhere between $10 and $39 trillion annually. Trillion. That's between 10 and 39% of global gross domestic product. Invisible, uncounted, uncompensated. If that sounds familiar, if it echoes something we discussed many hours ago about the Victorian lady's invisible household economy about Agnes, whose firekeeping and ale brewing held the whole structure together, without appearing in any record that mattered, that is because it is the same story, in a different century, with different clothes, but the same fundamental shape. Now I want to be careful here, because I do not want to reduce everything we have covered tonight to a simple complaint. The lives of women today are incomparably different from the lives of women in the medieval period or the Victorian era or the early Industrial Revolution. The legal rights, the access to education and professional life, the ability to leave a marriage, own property, vote, speak, travel, choose. These are not small things. They are enormous, and they were won at enormous cost by the women we have met throughout this story, and by the millions more whose names we do not know. I do not want to flatten that progress into nothing. But I do want to say this. The infrastructure has changed. The underlying architecture who is expected to be at the beginning of the day, responsible for the invisible labour that makes everything else possible, that architecture is still being built from the same original plans, and I think understanding where those plans came from and what they cost the people who lived under them is one of the most important things we can do. Let me ask you something else. When was the last time you did something purely for yourself, not for a child, a partner, a job, a parent, a responsibility, just for yourself in the middle of an ordinary day without guilt? Think about it honestly. For many women, that question produces a pause, sometimes a long one, and the pause itself is the answer. Throughout this entire story, what has struck me most is not the hardship, though the hardship was real. What has struck me is the persistent, extraordinary creativity with which women found ways to exist within the constraints placed on them. The medieval woman who managed her household with the skill of a small business owner. The Victorian lady who turned afternoon tea into a political instrument. The maid who became her mistress's most trusted confidant and in doing so accumulated a kind of power that no one formally recognized. The factory girl who turned her earnings into the deposit on a different kind of future. The writer who composed world-changing arguments in the fragments between other people's demands. The knocker-upper who walked dark streets at 3 a.m. and used those few pence to put her son through school. All of them, in their different ways, were doing what the human spirit does under constraint, finding the gaps, filling them with something of their own, building something larger than the space that was allowed. I want to tell you about one last woman. She does not have a famous name. I made her up in a way, or rather I assembled her from the thousands of ordinary women whose lives I read through over the course of researching this story. She's sitting somewhere right now. Maybe it is late. Maybe you're listening to this in the dark or in the blue-grey light of a phone screen, or with an earphone in while someone else in your house is asleep nearby. She's had a full day. She managed things, visible and invisible things. She showed up for people who needed her to show up. She carried things in her mind, the mental ledger of other people's needs, the list of tasks that cycles and never quite empties the background hum of responsibility that does not stop when the day officially does. And now at the end of it, she's doing this strange, quiet thing of listening to a voice tell her about women who lived before her, about Agnes who lit the fire, about the Vestal who kept the flame alive through the night, about the alewife who turned her kitchen skill into something resembling independence, about the Victorian lady who poured tea with the precision of a diplomat and managed the invisible accounts of an entire social world, about Florence who walked 4 miles of hospital wards in the dark counting the dead, about Mary Smith shooting dried peas at windows at 3 a.m, keeping the Industrial Revolution running one client at a time. This woman listening right now, maybe you, is the inheritor of all of those lives, not the suffering, not the constraint, the skill, the persistence, the knowledge of how to do a great deal with very little, the ability to hold many things at once without dropping them, the habit of finding the small gap of time that belongs only to you, however narrow it is, and putting something in it that matters. Those things did not come from nowhere. They came from women who practiced them generation after generation, often without knowing they were doing something that would pass forward. Here is what I believe after everything we've looked at tonight. The daily routine is not a small thing. It is the largest thing. It is where civilization actually happens, not in the grand moments, not in the parliamentary speeches, or the battlefield victories, or the technological breakthroughs, but in the 10,000 small acts that make it possible for people to wake up every morning and face the day. The fire that is lit, the bread that is made, the child who is fed, the letter that is written, the accounts that are kept, the network that is maintained, the question that is asked out loud at last when everyone else has decided the asking is impractical. Women have always been at the center of all of this, not always with recognition, not always with credit, not always with the freedom to do it on their own terms, but always there, always making the day function, always making it possible for the world to start again in the morning. I started this story by asking you to picture a woman opening her eyes in the dark, Agnes in her medieval cottage facing the cold and the dead fire and the long day of labour ahead. And I want to end it by asking you to picture yourself, wherever you are right now, whatever your day held, whatever waits for you on the other side of sleep. You're not disconnected from Agnes, or from the Vestal Virgin who stood watch over the sacred flame, or from the Victorian lady navigating her drawing room with the precision of a general, or from the suffragette who took the skills that domestic life had forged in her and used them to break the system that had forged her, or from Mary Smith walking East London at 3 a.m, shooting dried peas at windows so other people could make it to work on time. You are the next paragraph in a very long story, and the things you do every day, the visible ones and the invisible ones, the ones that get noticed and the ones that do not, those things will become part of the paragraph that comes after you. Not because you are famous, not because anyone is recording it, but because that is what daily life does. It carries forward. Thank you for spending tonight with me on this journey. I genuinely mean that. These are the stories that matter most to me, the ones that are hiding in the ordinary, the ones that only reveal themselves when you are patient enough to look closely at the everyday. If something we talked about tonight stayed with you, if some part of this story landed somewhere real, I would love to know. Leave a comment and tell me which woman in this story surprised you most, or tell me what your morning looks like. I will read every word. And if you found value in tonight, if this felt like time well spent, please share it with someone who you think would want to hear it. There is someone you know right now who needs to understand that the things they do every day, however invisible they feel, are part of something much larger than they realize. Take care of yourself tonight. Sleep well, and in the morning when you open your eyes, remember that the fire you light today is part of a flame that has been burning for a very, very long time.